Settle in. Let your shoulders come down away from your ears. Let your hands go loose in the warm, and let the day you have just finished slide off them and go. Tonight, we are going to spend a whole year inside a medieval monastery. One house, one valley, one set of walls, one turning of the seasons, from the beginning of December all the way round to the beginning of December again. Nothing will happen quickly. That is not a warning, it is a promise. Almost nothing that happened in a place like this ever happened quickly, and the men who lived there had gone to a great deal of trouble to arrange it that way. You do not need to remember anything. There is no thread to hold. If you drift off in the middle of a paragraph about bread, or about candles, or about the small door at the top of the night stairs, you will not have missed anything, because the whole point of the year we are about to walk through is that it comes round again. It always comes round again. That is the entire idea. Picture a valley in the north of England, somewhere in Yorkshire, in the middle of the 14th century. A stream running down the middle of it, cold and quick and clear over pale stones. Wooded slopes on both sides, oak and ash and hazel, and above the woods the open moor, brown and empty and going on for miles. It is not a comfortable place. Nobody built here because it was comfortable. They built here because it was quiet, and because there was running water, and because at the time the land was worth very little and somebody was willing to give it away. And in the bottom of that valley, low against the stream, there is a great gray church with a square tower, and a huddle of long stone buildings around a square courtyard beside it, and a wall running round the whole lot with an arched gate in one side, and a mill, and a row of fish ponds stepped down the slope like shallow trays, and barns, and a lane going away over the shoulder of the hill. It is the middle of the night. It is the first week of December. There is no moon, or if there is a moon it is behind cloud, and the valley is completely black except for one small yellow light burning in the gatehouse, where the porter keeps a lamp going all night. And one other light, higher up and further in, moving slowly along behind a row of windows. That second light is a lantern, and it is being carried by one man, and he is walking the length of a long upstairs room in which about 40 other men are asleep in their clothes. That is where we will begin. Not with the founding, not with the charter, not with the abbot or the archbishop or the king, with one man carrying a lantern down a dark dormitory in December, on his way to wake everybody up in the middle of the night, as he has done every night, and as somebody in that house has done every night for the last 200 years. Let us take a moment first, though, and go round the outside of the place while everyone is still asleep, because it helps to know the shape of a thing before you start living in it. The wall comes first. It is not a defensive wall, not really. It is about the height of a man and a half, dry stone in places and mortared in others, patched 100 times, with moss along the top and hart's tongue fern growing out of the cracks. It runs for the better part of a mile, all the way round the precinct, and it does not exist to keep armies out. It exists to draw a line. Inside it is one kind of world, outside it is another. Everything the wall encloses is called the precinct, and everything within the precinct belongs to the house, and every man who has taken vows in the house has promised, among other things, that he will stay inside that line for the rest of his life unless he is sent out. The gate is in the west wall, facing the lane. It is a stone arch, wide enough for a cart, with a smaller door cut into one leaf of the big timber gates for people on foot. Beside it, built into the wall, there is a little chamber with a fireplace and a bed and a window on each side, one looking in and one looking out. That is the porter's lodge. The porter is a monk, an older one usually, chosen because he is patient, and his job description is very short and very old. He is to have his lodging near the gate so that anyone who comes may always find somebody there to answer him. That is it. That is the whole of the job. Somebody is always there. Day, night, harvest, midwinter, snow, somebody is at that gate. In a world where almost nothing was reliable, that was one of the few things that was. Through the gate, and you were in the outer court, which is the noisy end of the monastery, at least by the standards of a place where hardly anybody speaks. This is the working yard. There is a bakehouse with a stone oven the size of a small room. There is a brewhouse next to it, because the two go together, both of them wanting fire and water and grain and a floor that can be swilled down. There is a granary up on staddle stones to keep the rats out, and a malt kiln, and a smithy with the forge banked for the night, and a stable and a cart shed, and a long open-fronted building where the wool is sorted, and a tannery placed carefully downwind of everything else. There is a guest hall on the right-hand side, close to the gate, so that visitors can be fed and bedded without ever walking into the quiet parts. There is the almonry, a low building against the wall, where the leftovers from the tables are brought out in the morning and given away to whoever is waiting. And past all of that, through a second and smaller gate, is the inner court, and here the noise stops. The church stands along the north side, the biggest building by far, its roof high enough that from the bottom of the valley it looks as though the hill has grown a stone shoulder. It is not the church of a town. It has no screen crowded with painted saints, no side chapels stuffed with tombs, no altars glittering with plate, or at least it did not start with any of those, and in the strictest houses it never got them. It is long, and it is high, and it is astonishingly plain, and it is arranged around one single fact, which is that a certain number of men need to be able to stand facing each other in 2 rows in the middle of it and sing. Attached to the south side of the church, tucked into the angle of it, is the cloister. This is the heart of the place, and it is worth understanding properly because everything else hangs off it. The cloister is a square. Around all 4 sides of the square runs a covered walk, a stone passage with a lean-to roof, and an open arcade of small columns looking inward. In the middle, open to the sky, is a square of grass, usually with a well or a washing basin in it, sometimes with a single tree. The 4 walks of the cloister are the corridors of the building, the reading room, the schoolroom, the workshop, and the only place where a monk may lawfully be when he is not required to be anywhere else. Off the east walk, next to the church, is the chapter house, where the community meets every morning. Beyond it, the parlor, the one small room where speaking is permitted. Above the whole east range, running the length of it, is the dorter, the dormitory, and out of the north end of the dorter, a flight of stairs comes down directly into the transept of the church, so that the monks can go from their beds to their stalls without going outside and without passing through a single door that leads anywhere else. Those are the night stairs, and they are worn into hollows. Off the south walk is the freighter, the dining hall, long and high, with a stone pulpit set into the wall halfway down. Next to it the kitchen, and next to that the warming house, which we will talk about a great deal when we get to January, because in a building of this kind, the warming house is the single most important room in the world for about 4 months of the year. Off the west walk is the cellarer's range, storerooms below, and in many houses, the lay brothers' quarters above. And that is the pattern. Church on the north, chapter house on the east, dining hall on the south, stores on the west, cloister in the middle, dormitory upstairs. Once you know it, you know almost every monastery in Europe, because they all followed the same plan, with local variations for something like 600 years. A monk from Yorkshire, set down blindfolded in a house in Burgundy or Bavaria, would have been able to find his way to the washing place in the dark. He would have known which way the reader faced at dinner, which corner the novices sat in, which side of the church the abbot's stall was on, and roughly how many steps it was from his bed to it. There is something quietly lovely about that, and it is worth holding on to as we go. The whole system was designed so that a man could stop making decisions. Not because he was incapable of making them, but because he had concluded, rightly or wrongly, that the constant low-grinding effort of deciding what to do next was the thing that was wearing him out. So he handed the decisions over to the calendar and the bell and the rule, and in return he got a life in which he almost never had to wonder what he was supposed to be doing next. The clock, in this case, was the sky and a candle and a rope. Nobody in that valley owned a clock. Mechanical clocks did exist by the 14th century, and a few great houses had them, iron frames with weights and a great slow escapement that clacked and shuddered and needed constant nursing, but most monasteries did not, and none of them relied on one. What they relied on was a man whose entire duty was to know what time it was. He is called the sacrist, or in the greater houses he has an assistant for exactly this, and the tools available to him are these: a candle marked in bands, burning down at a rate that he has measured, a vessel of water with a small hole in it, the position of certain stars in a certain window, which he has learned from the man who held the office before him, who learned it from the man before that, the sound of the stream, which runs louder in wet weather, and, above all, a habit of waking that has been ground into him over 20 or 30 years, so that he surfaces out of sleep at more or less the right hour, whether he wants to or not. He gets it wrong sometimes. Every monastery has stories about the night the bell went too early and the whole community stood in the dark for an hour and a half, or the night it went too late and the sun came up in the middle of the night office, which was considered a small disgrace. There were books written about how to reckon the hours, full of tables and shadows, and the length of a man's own foot measured against his own shadow at noon, and the general conclusion of all of them is that it is difficult, and that you do the best you can, and that God is patient. So, the lantern comes down the dormitory. The dorter is one long room, the whole upper floor of the east range, with a row of small windows on each side and a timber roof high above. It has no ceiling. The beds are down each wall, and depending on the house and the century, they are either open, just a straw mattress on a low wooden frame with a blanket, or divided from each other by low partitions of board that give a man about as much privacy as a stall in a stable, which is more or less the intention. There is no fire. There has never been a fire. There is not so much as a brazier, because the rule does not allow one, and because a building full of straw mattresses under a timber roof is not a place where anybody sensible lights a fire. The men in the beds are wearing their clothes, all of them. This is not laziness, and it is not squalor, it is instruction. The rule is explicit that the monks are to sleep clothed and girded, so that they are always ready to rise without delay. In practice, that means the woolen tunic, the long habit over it, the belt, and often the stockings, with the boots off and set by the bed where the feet can find them in the dark. In winter, many of them will also have their day cloak over the blanket, and they will not be warm, and they will know they are not going to be warm. And they will have stopped expecting it years ago. The sacrist walks the length of the room with his lantern held low, and at each bed he does not shout and does not shake anybody. He may tap the frame. He may simply let the light fall on a face for a moment. In some houses he carries a small handbell and rings it once, quietly, at the head of the room. Then he goes to the church and pulls the rope. And now the great bell goes, and it goes on going, and every man in that long, dark room sits up. There is a particular quality to the noise of 40 men getting out of bed in the dark in a stone building, and it is not what you would expect. It is soft. It is the rustle of wool and the knock of a boot against a bed leg, and somebody coughing, and the flat slap of feet on boards, and no voices at all. Nobody says good morning. Nobody says anything. They pull on their boots, they draw up their hoods, and they go down the night stairs in a slow file into the transept of the church, where a handful of candles are already burning at the altar and a couple more in the stalls, and the rest of the building is enormous and black above them. It is somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. Outside the church there is frost on the grass and a fox going along the wall, and absolutely nothing else awake for a mile in any direction, and they begin to sing. This is the office of vigils, sometimes called matins, the night office, and it is the longest of the day. On an ordinary winter night, it will run for well over an hour. On a great feast, it will run for 2, and on the greatest feasts, it will run until the eastern windows start to go gray. It consists of psalms, a great many psalms, said and sung antiphonally, which means one side of the choir sings a verse and the other side sings the next, back and forth, like 2 men sawing a log. Between the psalms there are readings, lessons taken from Scripture and from the Fathers and from the life of whichever saint the day belongs to, read aloud by a monk standing at a lectern with a candle beside the page. The pattern of it is the thing. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in Italy in the 6th century by a man who wanted to lay down what he called a little rule for beginners, specifies that the community should get through the whole of the Psalter, all 150 psalms, in the course of 1 week, every week. Then start again. Benedict adds, rather dryly, that monks who cannot manage the whole Psalter in a week are showing themselves lazy, since he has read that the fathers of the desert used to do the lot in a single day. Do the arithmetic on that, and you arrive at a fact which explains a great deal about these men. A monk who entered at 17 and died at 70 sang the entire Psalter through, from beginning to end, something like 2,500 times. He did not know the Psalms. He was made of them. They were not text to him. They were the inside of his own head. The way a song you heard 10,000 times as a child is not really a song any more, but a piece of your own furniture. Ask him for a word, and the word that came would have a psalm behind it. And this is worth sitting with for a minute, because it is the answer to the question that everybody asks about monasteries, which is, what on earth did they do all day? They did this. This was the work. Not a preparation for the work, not a devotional interlude in a working day. The Latin phrase is opus Dei, the work of God, and the word work is doing real labor in that phrase. A monastery was a machine for producing continuous prayer, and the monks were the moving parts, and the day was engineered around keeping the machine running without a gap. Vigils ends. There is now a stretch of dark. In summer it is very short, and in December it is quite long, and what happens in it depends on the house and the season. In the deep of winter, the community may go back up the night stairs and lie down again for an hour or two. Very often they do not, and instead they stay in the church or in the cloister and read, or pray privately, or simply sit. In the coldest months, in many houses, this is the moment when the older monks quietly slip along to the warming house to stand near the fire for a while, and everybody knows they are doing it, and nobody says a word about it. Then, at first light, the bell again, and the office of Lauds. Lauds is the dawn office, and it is a beautiful one, full of psalms about morning and light and birds and the works of creation. It is supposed to be sung as the sun comes up. Getting it to land exactly on the sunrise, in a country where the sun rises at 4 in the morning in June and a quarter to 8 in the morning in December, is one of the standing difficulties of the sacrist's life. And it is why the timing of vigils slides about the night the way it does. After Lauds, prime, the first hour said as the working day begins, then chapter. And we will come to chapter properly in a moment, because it is the one part of the day that is not sung. Then terce, the third hour, in the middle of the morning. Then sext, the sixth hour, at midday. Then none, the ninth hour, in the middle of the afternoon. Then vespers, in the evening, at the lighting of the lamps. Then, last of all, compline, said at the end of the day, in the dusk or in candlelight, after which nobody speaks to anybody until the following morning. 8 offices: vigils, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Some of them are long and some of them are very short indeed, 10 minutes and done. They are hung on the day like beads on a string, and no interval between any two of them is longer than about 3 hours. Think about what that does to the shape of a life. You can never quite settle into anything. You cannot lose an afternoon. You cannot get so deep into a piece of work that you forget where you are, because in a little while the bell will go and you will put down whatever you are holding at once, immediately, and go. Benedict is emphatic about this. When the signal is given, he writes, everything is to be left, and the monk is to come with all speed, and he says that if a brother is writing a letter, he should not even finish the letter he is on. Not the word, the letter. That instruction sounds harsh until you have lived under it for a while, and then it turns into something else entirely, which is freedom from the tyranny of finishing. Nothing has to be finished today. Nothing has to be finished this week. The work will still be there tomorrow, and the bell will go again tomorrow, and none of it depends on you. And there is one more thing about those hours that is easy to miss, and it is my favorite fact about the medieval day. The hours were not the same length as ours. An hour, to these men, was 1/12th part of the daylight, whatever the daylight happened to be. So in June an hour was long, and in December an hour was short, and the day breathed in and out across the year like a pair of lungs. The offices did not sit at fixed points on a dial. They floated with the sun. Terce in December fell at a different clock time from terce in June, and nobody minded. And nobody would have understood why you would want it otherwise, because the sun was the clock, and the sun had always been the clock, and would go on being the clock long after they were all in the ground. That is the frame. 8 bells, a psalter every week, a day made of daylight divided into 12. Now let us live inside it, and let us start where the year starts, in the dark of the first week of December, at the beginning of Advent, and go round. Before we go into the winter, we should meet the household, because a monastery was not a crowd of identical men in identical clothes, whatever it looked like from the gate. It was an organization, with offices and accounts and specialists, and every man in it had a job that had a name. Start at the top and work down. The abbot, he is elected by the community for life, and once elected he holds a position of quite startling authority. The rule tells the monks to obey him as they would obey Christ, and tells him at very great length and in a rather anxious tone that he will have to answer for every single soul in the house, and that he had better remember he is going to be judged on how he ran the place. Benedict spends more words worrying about the character of the abbot than about almost anything else. He is to be a father and not a tyrant. He is to know that he has undertaken the care of souls and not the exercise of power. He is to arrange things so that the strong have something to long for and the weak have nothing to run from, which is one of the wisest sentences ever written about managing people and is well over 1,000 years old. In a big house, the abbot is also, whether he likes it or not, a great landowner. He has estates, tenants, courts, lawsuits, taxes, and a place in the councils of the realm. He may be away for weeks. He has his own lodging, separate from the dormitory, and his own hall for entertaining guests of rank, and by the 14th century he probably eats most of his meals there rather than in the freighter with everybody else, which the stricter sort of monk grumbles about in private and occasionally in writing. Under him, the prior, who actually runs the house day to day, and under the prior, the sub-prior, and in the largest houses, a third prior as well, because somebody always has to be on duty. And then the obedientiaries, the officers, each with a department and a budget and a set of keys. The sacrist has the church, the fabric, the roof, the glass, the bells, the vessels, the vestments, the lights. He is the man who knows how many candles the house burns in a year, which is an enormous number, and where the wax comes from, and what it costs, and he is the one who has to find the money when a gale takes slates off the presbytery roof in February. He keeps time, as we have said. He is often the busiest man in the building. The precentor has the singing. He decides what is sung and when. He starts the psalms. He sets the pitch. He corrects the boys. He keeps the books that the singing comes out of. And because he keeps books, he very often ends up in charge of all the books, which makes him the librarian. And because he is the librarian, he is often in charge of the scriptorium as well, and therefore of parchment, ink, quills, and the great slow business of copying. The cellarer has everything that can be eaten, drunk, stored, bought, or sold: food, drink, fuel, the mills, the barns, the granges out on the estates, the carts, the buying and the selling. He is, in modern terms, the chief executive of a substantial agricultural business. The rule says he should be chosen as a man who is wise, mature, temperate, not greedy, not proud, not a troublemaker, not slow, not wasteful, and who will not upset the brethren, which is a list that suggests Benedict had met a few cellarers who were. The kitchener runs the kitchen and works to the cellarer. The refectorian looks after the dining hall, the tables, the cloths, the cups, the washing. The chamberlain looks after clothing and bedding, which means he is in charge of a whole department of shearing, spinning, weaving, fulling, cutting, sewing, mending, washing, and the annual issue of new habits and new boots. The infirmarian runs the infirmary. The almoner gives away the alms. The guest master looks after the guests. The novice master trains the new men. The master of the works keeps the building standing. Each of these men keeps a roll. Parchment strips, sewn end to end, written up at the end of the year, listing income and expenditure in painstaking detail. Those rolls survive in their thousands, and they are the reason we know as much as we do about how these houses actually worked. And they are wonderful reading if you like that sort of thing, which I do, and which is why in a minute I am going to tell you what a monastery spent on shoes. Below the officers, the choir monks, the main body of the community who are the men in the stalls. In a great abbey, there might be 100 of them in the good years. In a modest house in the north in the 14th century, after the plague years, there might be 20 or 30 rattling round buildings that had been designed for twice that many, which is one of the quiet melancholies of the later Middle Ages, and you can still see it in the ruins, where the choir stalls stop well short of where the stone tells you they used to reach. And in the Cistercian houses, and in some others, there is a second community living alongside the first, and it is easy to forget them, so let us not. The lay brothers. Conversi, men who joined the house but did not become choir monks, who could not read Latin and were not expected to learn it, who took the same vows of poverty, chastity, and stability, wore a slightly different habit, kept a beard where the choir monks were shaven, and did the work. They farmed the granges, they herded the sheep, they ran the mills and the forges and the tanneries. They had their own quarters in the West Range, their own stalls at the back of the church, their own shortened round of prayers, which they said by heart because they could not read them, and their own refectory. At the height of the Cistercian expansion, the lay brothers outnumbered the choir monks in some houses by 2 or 3 to 1. A great abbey might have 500 of them scattered across granges that lay a day's ride from the mother house. They are the reason those abbeys became so rich in wool. They are also the reason a Cistercian house could farm on a scale nobody else in England could match. Because they were an enormous, disciplined, unpaid, permanent workforce who did not go home at harvest and did not have to be hired again in the spring. They largely disappear in the 14th century, and the reason is not romantic. After the plague, labor was scarce and wages were high, and a man who would previously have become a lay brother for his bread could now get paid properly for the same work and go where he liked. So the granges were let out to tenants, and the great lay brothers' ranges were partitioned into storerooms, and by the time our year begins, there might be 6 of them left, where once there were 60. Now, chapter. Every morning, after prime, the whole community walks along the east cloister walk into the chapter house, which is often the most beautiful room in the monastery after the church itself, a wide vaulted space with stone benches running all the way round the walls and the abbot's seat at the east end. They sit in order of seniority, and seniority means the date you entered, not your age and not your birth. A duke's son who came in last year sits below a plowman's son who came in the year before. And that is not a sentimental detail. It is written into the rule, and it was enforced. Benedict says flatly that the community is not to be ordered by birth, and that a man who is a slave and a man who is free are to be treated the same, because we are all one in Christ and bear an equal burden of service under one Lord. The business of chapter is fixed, and it goes like this. First, a chapter of the rule is read aloud, which is where the room and the meeting get their name. The rule is short enough that reading it a chapter a day gets you through the whole thing about 3 times a year. which means that the average monk heard the entire rule read to him something like 150 times in his life. Then the martyrology, the list of saints for the following day. Then the necrology, the roll of the dead, the names of everybody connected with the house who died on this day in previous years, going back centuries, so that a man who died in the year 1200 was still having his name read aloud in the year 1400, and the community still stopped and prayed for him. That is what all those endowments were buying, not a monument. A name read out in a cold room on a winter morning forever, then the business, announcements, letters, the abbot speaking about whatever needs speaking about, assignment of tasks, the bringing in of a novice or the profession of a new brother, and then the part that everybody who reads about monasteries finds extraordinary, which is the chapter of faults. Any monk who has broken the rule is expected to come out into the middle of the floor, prostrate himself, and say what he has done. He tripped on the step and dropped a book. He fell asleep during the night office. He broke a jug. He spoke in the cloister. He was late 3 times this week. He looked out of the window during the reading. He was angry with a brother over a stool. The penances are correspondingly small. Say some psalms. Eat at a separate table. Stand at the door of the church for a day. Take the lowest place in the choir for a week. And here is the thing that only becomes obvious when you have read a few hundred of these entries, which is that the offenses are almost unbelievably trivial, and that this is the point. It is not a court. It is a maintenance schedule. When 40 men live in one building for 50 years, sleeping in one room, eating at one table, singing shoulder to shoulder 8 times a day, and never leaving, the thing that will destroy them is not scandal. It is accumulation. It is the 20th time somebody clears his throat during the same psalm. It is the man who always takes the last piece of bread. It is a stool and a jug and a step and a small resentment left to sit for 11 years until it is the size of a house. So they took it out into the middle of the floor every morning and put it down, out loud, in front of everybody. And then it was over, and it was not carried upstairs. If you ask me for one thing to take away from all of this, at the level of ordinary human life, it would be that. Not the Psalms and not the fasting. The chapter of faults. Every morning, in the cold, before breakfast, say the small, stupid thing out loud and then let it go. The other thing that shaped every hour of the day was the silence, and it is worth being accurate about it, because it is almost always described wrongly. Medieval monks did not take a vow of silence. There is no such vow. The 3 vows in the Benedictine profession are stability, which means staying in this house, obedience, and what the rule calls conversion of life, which is a broad and rather beautiful phrase meaning the whole ongoing business of becoming a different sort of person. Silence is not a vow. It is a discipline, and it is not absolute, and it is regulated by place and by hour rather than by principle. There were places where you could speak. The parlor, obviously, which takes its name from exactly this. The chapter house during the meeting. The infirmary, where the sick were allowed a good deal of latitude. The abbot's lodging when summoned. The fields and the workshops where instructions had to be given. The guest hall, because a guest could not be left standing in silence. And there were places where you could not, and the great one was the cloister. The cloister was the silent place. Also the church, except for what was being sung. Also the dormitory. Also the refectory during meals, where the only voice permitted was the reader's. And above all, after Compline, everywhere, for everybody, without exception, until the following morning. That is the great silence, and it is the one that even the laxest houses in the worst centuries tried to keep, because it is the one that makes the sleep work. Which meant, of course, that they invented a way of talking without speaking. Monastic sign language is one of the most charming things in the whole medieval record. Lists of the signs survive from several houses, and they are wonderfully practical, because they were not devised by theorists, they were devised by hungry men at a table who wanted the salt. For bread, you make a circle with both thumbs and both forefingers, because a loaf is round. For milk, you draw your little finger across your lips like a calf sucking. For fish, you wag your hand flat in the air like a tail in water. For eel, you hold your fist as though gripping something and make it wriggle. For honey, you touch your tongue with your fingers. For an apple, you close your fist and put your thumb between the fingers. For a book, you make the motion of turning a page. For a psalter, you make the sign for a book and then put your hand on your head, because the crown was worn by the king who wrote the Psalms. For a candle, you blow on your forefinger. For a knife, you draw your finger along the flat of your other hand as though whetting a blade. And the lists get quite specific, which is where they become funny and human. There are separate signs for different kinds of fish. There are signs for mustard, which involve holding your nose. There are signs for a woman, which in most of the lists involves drawing your finger along your eyebrow, which is the sort of thing that makes you wonder how many hours of debate went into it. In one English list there is a sign meaning I do not know, and a sign meaning it does not matter, and a sign meaning later. And reading them, you get a very vivid sense of a room full of men trying to have an ordinary conversation with their hands over a bowl of pottage while somebody reads aloud from the book of Job. Some houses complained that the signing had got out of hand and that the brethren were effectively gossiping all through dinner in complete silence, which is one of the great small comedies of the Middle Ages. There are visitation records in which an inspecting bishop notes crossly that the monks make so many signs at table that it would be quieter if they simply talked. Now let us take one man and put him through the door, because the shape of the ear is easier to feel if there is somebody in it who is also feeling it for the first time. Say a young man arrives at the gate in Advent. He is perhaps 18 or 20. In an earlier century he might have arrived at 7, given by his parents as what was called an oblat, a child offered to God, and raised in the cloister with no memory of anything else. But by the 14th century that practice has more or less died out, and men come as adults by choice for reasons that are usually a mixture of the spiritual, the practical, and the domestic in proportions that nobody has ever been able to separate. The rule says he is to be made to wait outside for 4 or 5 days, knocking, and treated coolly to see whether he really means it. In practice, the porter lets him in and gives him something to eat, and he sleeps in the guest hall, and then somebody talks to him. If he is accepted, he goes to the novice master, and for a year he lives slightly apart from the community. He sits in his own corner of the cloister. He is taught the psalms, the chant, the rule, the signs, the order of the offices, when to bow and how far, which foot to lead with, how to hold a book, how to fold a habit, how to sleep in his clothes without wrecking them, how to get from a dead sleep to a choir stall in 4 minutes in the dark without waking up properly, which is a genuine skill and takes months. The rule says that during his novice year the whole of the rule is to be read to him 3 times over, and that he is to be told plainly all the hard and rough things through which the way to God lies, and that he is to be given every opportunity to leave, and that the door is open, and nobody will hold it against him at the end of the year, if he still wants to. He makes his profession in the chapter house in front of the whole community, writes out his vow in his own hand if he can write, lays it on the altar, and is clothed. And that is a moment worth pausing on, because the clothing tells you a great deal about the life. He gets a tunic of undyed wool. Over it a habit, a long garment with a hood, again undyed, or in the black houses, dyed black. In the Cistercian houses left the natural color of the fleece, which is where the 2 orders get their nicknames, the black monks and the white monks. Over that, for choir, a cowl, which is an enormous voluminous garment with sleeves like sails, ridiculous to work in, magnificent to stand in, and specifically designed so that 40 men standing in 2 rows look like one thing rather than 40 things. A belt. A scapular, which is a working apron of the same cloth, hung front and back over the shoulders. Worn for manual labor so that the good habit stays clean. Stockings, boots for the day, and softer shoes for the night, because a man walking down a stone stair at 2 in the morning should not sound like a horse. 2 of everything, so that one can be washed. And the rule is explicit that when a monk receives new clothes, he must give back the old ones, which are then put in the store for the poor. And that he is not to complain about the color or the coarseness of the cloth, but to take what is available in the district at the lowest price. He owns none of it. That is the point that is hardest for us. A monk owned nothing at all. Not the habit on his back, not the knife at his belt, not the book he had spent 9 months copying, not the bed he slept in. He had the use of things. The rule uses a lovely phrase for what he is to receive, which is whatever is necessary, and it says that the abbot should give to each according to his need, and that anyone who needs less should thank God and not be sad, and anyone who needs more should be humbled by his weakness and not proud of the mercy shown him. And Benedict adds, because he clearly knew exactly what he was dealing with, that above all the vice of private ownership is to be cut out of the monastery by the roots, and that nobody is to presume to give or receive anything without permission, or to have anything whatever as his own, not a book, not a writing tablet, not a pen, nothing at all. He is also given a haircut, and it is the famous one. The tonsure, the crown of the head shaved bare with a ring of hair left round it, renewed every few weeks by a brother with a razor and a bowl of warm water, sitting in the cloister with the light coming in over his shoulder. In the Middle Ages, that ring of hair was not a joke. It was a legal status. A tonsured man was a clerk, and a clerk could not be tried in a secular court, and could not be hanged by a sheriff, and stood under a different law from every other man in England. Shaving the top of your head was, in a real sense, the strongest passport available. And then the young man goes and sits in his stall at the very bottom of the order of seniority, next to the door, in the coldest drought, and there he will stay, moving up one place at a time as the men above him die, for the next 50 years. There is one more thing to say about him before we let the years start, and it is the vow that people notice least and that mattered most. Stability, not just that he will be a monk, but that he will be a monk here, in this house, in this valley, for life. He may be sent elsewhere on business. He may be sent to found a daughter house, but he does not get to move because he is unhappy. or bored, or because the abbot annoys him, or because he thinks there is a better house over the hill with warmer cloisters and a nicer library. Benedict has a whole passage about the sort of monk he cannot stand, and it is the one who drifts. He calls them gyrovagues, wanderers in circles, always on the move, 3 days in this house and 4 in that, never settling, always guests and never members, and he says they are the worst kind of all, and he will say nothing more about them, because it is better to be silent than to speak. Stability is the vow that makes everything else work. It is what makes the chapter of faults necessary, because you cannot leave, so the grievance has to be dealt with. It is what makes the seniority order tolerable, because everybody is moving up the same queue at the same rate. It is what makes the work possible, because a man who is planting an oak wood knows perfectly well that he will be buried under it. And it is what makes the year we are about to walk through feel the way it feels, which is not like a year exactly, but like one turn of something much longer. So, Advent. The first week of December. The year begins here, because the church year begins here 4 Sundays before Christmas, and everything in the house is counted from it. Advent in a northern valley is a season of almost pure darkness. The sun comes up somewhere around 7:45, and it is gone again by 4 in the afternoon, and on a bad week it does not really come up at all. It simply becomes a paler shade of gray behind the cloud for a few hours and then gives up. There are 8 hours of usable light, and the offices have to fit inside them, and the manual work has to fit inside them too, and the result is a day that feels squeezed at both ends. The community rises for vigils, and it is a very long way from morning. They come down the night stairs, and the church is so cold that the stone takes the warmth out of the soles of their feet through the leather. Their breath goes up in the candlelight in long, slow plumes. In hard weather, the water in the stoop by the door has a skin of ice on it, and the wine in the cruets by the altar has to be thawed at the sacredest little brazier before it can be used. And in the very worst weeks, it freezes in the chalice. There are complaints about this, and they are lovely because they are so ordinary. A monk writing about winter in an English cloister mentions ink freezing on the pen, which every scribe in northern Europe complains about. Others mention that the singing goes flat because nobody's mouth is working properly. There is a memorable note from one house about a brother who could not turn the pages of the book at the lectern because his fingers had stopped bending, and the man beside him turned them for him, and nothing else is said about it, and it is one of my favorite sentences in the whole of medieval literature. The Advent office has a particular quality. It is a season of waiting rather than of celebration. The great joyful hymn is not sung. The color of the vestments changes to violet. The readings turn to the prophets, mostly Isaiah, and they are all about watching and waiting and looking towards something that has not arrived yet. And if you have ever sat in a cold room in December in a northern country, you will know exactly why the church put those readings there, because they describe the actual weather of the human mind in that month with uncanny precision. And in the last week before Christmas come the great antiphons, one on each of the 7 evenings, sung at Vespers before and after the canticle. Each one begins with the word O, and each addresses the one who is coming by a different title. O wisdom, O Lord of the house of Israel, O root of Jesse, O key of David, O dayspring, brightness of eternal light, O King of the nations, O God with us. They are sung slowly, and they are sung to a very old melody, and the practice was that on each of those 7 evenings a different officer of the house had the duty of starting the antiphon, and then afterwards providing a small extra ration for the community. So the cellarer took one night and gave everybody a little extra wine or a better loaf. The kitchener took another. The chamberlain another. It is a small thing, but you can feel the human warmth in it. 7 nights running in the coldest week of the year, each with a slightly better supper attached, and the whole house knowing whose turn it was. The warming house comes into its own now. It has a plain and honest name, and in Latin it is called the calefactory, and it is a room off the cloister with a great open fire in the middle of the floor, or a large fireplace in one wall, and it is the only room in the entire monastery, apart from the kitchen and the infirmary, where there is deliberate heat. The fire in it is lit in most houses on the 1st of November, or on the Feast of All Saints, and it is kept in until Easter, and the lighting of it is a small event in the life of the house. From that day until spring there is one place a man can go and be warm, and he is allowed to go there at certain times, and he does. You can imagine the scene without any help from me. A stone room, not very large, with benches round the walls. A fire of logs on a raised hearth, throwing an unsteady orange light on the vault. Perhaps a dozen men standing in a rough ring with their backs to it, and their hands behind them, hoods down, faces flushed on one side and gray on the other. The steam coming off wet wool in a visible cloud. Nobody saying much, because in many houses talking was allowed here, and in others it was not. And either way, the fire does most of the talking. The warming house had one other very specific use, and it is the reason so many of them have a large flat area or a long bench near the hearth. This is where the grease was warmed. Monks working outside in winter greased their boots, and the chamberlain's account rolls have entries for tallow and for goose grease bought expressly for this purpose. And on certain days the community would come in and sit and grease their boots at the fire, one after another, and I find that image extraordinarily restful. 40 men in a warm room in December, silently rubbing fat into leather, with the smell of it and the light of the fire, and the rain going along the cloister roof outside. The other winter task that clusters in these weeks is candles, and here we have to talk about the sheer scale of the lighting problem. A monastery in December needs light at 2 in the morning, at 5 in the morning, at 4 in the afternoon, and at 7 in the evening. It needs light in a church the size of a small cathedral. It needs light on the pages of books being read aloud, and on the pages of books being written. It needs a light burning perpetually before the altar, which is not optional and never goes out. It needs light in the dormitory stairs, in the infirmary, in the kitchen, in the gatehouse. There are 2 ways to make light, and they are not equal. Tallow is rendered animal fat, usually mutton or beef, poured or dipped around a rush or a linen wick. It is cheap, it can be made at home from your own beasts, and it is disgusting. It burns with a smoky yellow flame, it drips, it goes soft in warm weather and hard in cold, it needs its wick trimmed every few minutes, or it starts to gutter and smoke. And above all, it smells strongly of the animal it came out of. A room lit by a dozen tallow candles smells like a kitchen where something has gone wrong. Beeswax is the other. It burns clean, it burns bright, it holds its shape, it smells faintly of honey, and it is expensive, sometimes 10 or 12 times the price of tallow. So beeswax goes on the altar, and in the great candles of the feasts, and tallow goes everywhere else. And the accounts of every house in England record the difference in careful pounds and shillings. The sacrist's roll from a middling English abbey might record several hundredweight of wax bought in a year, and rather more tallow than that. And the numbers are big enough that the house keeps its own bees precisely because wax is such a serious expense, and the almoner in some houses gets the ends and stubs of the altar candles as a perquisite to give away, and there are disputes recorded about exactly who owns the drippings, which tells you everything about how valuable the stuff was. So through Advent, in the odd corners of the day, in the outer court where the smell will not carry, tallow is being rendered in a great pot, and the smell of it is over that end of the precinct for a week, and men are dipping wicks and hanging them up on rods to cool and dipping them again, layer on layer, 20 and 30 times, until each one is fat enough to burn. And then, Christmas. The great feasts of the medieval church were not celebrated the way we celebrate. The celebration was mostly in the office, which means it was mostly at night, and it means it was mostly long. On Christmas Eve, the community goes to bed early, if it goes to bed at all, and vigils begins at the ordinary hour, but it does not end at the ordinary hour, because on this night the night office is sung out to its full length with all its lessons and all its responsories. And then it runs directly into the first Mass, and then into Lauds, and by the time the community comes out of the church there is a gray line over the eastern moor. The church has been made ready. There are lights everywhere, and this is one of the 2 nights of the year when the house is genuinely extravagant with wax. Great candles on the altar and on the beam above it and on the steps. The best vestments out of the chest, the ones with gold thread that are otherwise only used 4 or 5 times a year, and that the sacrist has been checking and mending since the middle of November. Green boughs in some houses, ivy and holly and yew brought in from the woods, though the strict orders frown at it, and the crib in the houses that keep one, which by the 14th century is spreading everywhere, and they sing the psalm about the day and the night and the shining out of light and darkness in a stone building in the middle of the night in December in the north of England, with the frost cracking outside and every man in the room half asleep and completely certain of where he is supposed to be standing. If there is one moment in the monastic year when the whole enormous apparatus makes obvious sense even to somebody who does not share a word of the belief behind it, that is the moment. The 12 days that follow are the longest holiday in the monastic year, and they are a genuine holiday, in the sense that the manual work stops almost entirely, and the food gets better, and the day loosens. Loosens is a relative word. The offices still go. The bell still rings at 2 in the morning. But between them there is time, and time is the scarcest commodity in the whole institution, and for 12 days there is a little of it. The Kitchener's rolls tell you what the loosening tasted like. Extra ale, a good deal of it, brewed specially in the weeks before. White bread instead of the ordinary Maslin loaf, which is a mixed grain bread of wheat and rye that is heavy and dark and perfectly good, but is not white bread. Fish of the better kinds. Spices, which in a medieval account roll is always the sign of a feast, because pepper and ginger and cinnamon and saffron came a very long way and cost accordingly. In many houses, cheese and eggs return to the table, having been absent through the Advent fast, and in the houses that permitted it, meat. And we will come to the long and complicated story of monks and meat when we get to Lent, because it is one of the great running arguments of the Middle Ages and it went on for 400 years. There are entertainments of a sort, and they are odder than you might expect. In cathedral priories and in houses with schools attached there is the boy bishop, which is one of the strangest and most likable customs in the medieval calendar. On the Feast of the Holy Innocents, at the end of December, one of the choir boys is elected bishop by the others. He is dressed in a small mitre and a small cope. He is given a small crozier, and for the day he takes the bishop's place in the ceremonies, while the actual dignitaries of the house take the lower seats and let him get on with it. He preaches. Somebody usually writes the sermon for him. There are records of towns paying for the boy bishop's robes, and of him going in procession through the streets collecting money, and of grown men in very senior positions in the church sitting in the back row being solemnly blessed by a 12-year-old. It is a version of the world turned upside down, which the Middle Ages loved and which they built into their calendar deliberately, and the theology of it is not complicated. He has put down the mighty from their seats and exalted the humble and meek. Once a year, in the darkest week, you act it out, and then everybody goes back to their proper stall, and the year continues. There is dice and there is chess in some houses at this season, and in others there is not. And there is much correspondence from bishops on the subject, and the correspondence is generally against. Then the new year comes, and then Epiphany at the beginning of January, and after Epiphany the door shuts on the whole business, and the house goes into the deepest quiet of its year. January and February in a northern monastery are the still center. There is no farm work worth doing. The ground is either frozen or a bog. The days are so short that outdoor labor is barely possible. The community is more or less sealed inside its own buildings for 8 or 9 weeks, and this is the period in which the house is most purely itself, doing nothing but the offices, the reading, the copying, the mending, and the waiting. The weather gets into the accounts. There are entries for repairs to the church roof after gales. There are entries for a new lock on the outer gate. There are entries for straw, a great deal of straw, for the beds and for the byres. There are entries for the mending of shoes, which is worth dwelling on for a moment because the numbers are so revealing. A monastery of 40 men in the 14th century might spend on footwear alone a sum equivalent to the annual wages of several skilled craftsmen. The chamberlain buys leather, and he buys the services of a cobbler, or he keeps one, and the boots come in for repair constantly, because a man walking on whetstone 8 times a day and on wet fields for the rest of it goes through soles at a rate that we, who mostly walk on carpet, would find hard to believe. There are houses where the annual issue is 2 pairs each, and houses where it is 1. And there are rolls that list the mending of individual pairs by name, so that you can watch one brother's boots being patched 3 times in a winter and then finally replaced in March. There is another thing that happens in this dead season, and it is the one that surprises people most, and it is my favorite of all the monastic customs, so let us take it slowly. It is called Sani, from the Latin for bloodletting, and it works like this. 4 or 5 times a year, at intervals set by the calendar, the community is bled, not because anybody is ill, because it was believed on the best medical authority available that the body accumulates excess blood, and that letting some of it off at regular intervals keeps a man in balance and prevents illness before it starts. The medicine is wrong. The consequences were wonderful, because you cannot bleed a whole community at once and still sing the night office. So the house is bled in batches. A group of 8 or 10 goes at a time, And they go to the infirmary, and a barber or the infirmarian opens a vein in the arm and takes off a quantity of blood into a bowl, and then that group is excused. Excused for 3 or 4 days from almost everything. They do not have to rise for the night office. They may sleep through. They eat in the infirmary, where the food is better and where meat is permitted even in houses where it is otherwise banned. They may sit by the fire. They are given wine. They may talk. They may walk in the orchard. They are, in effect, sent on a short holiday with medical justification 4 or 5 times a year in rotation forever, and the records show with a candor that is very endearing that everybody understood perfectly well what was really going on. There are visitation complaints about brethren who contrive to be bled more often than the schedule allows. There are houses where the Sini period had crept from 3 days to a week. There are abbots writing to say that the minutians, as they were called, had become an occasion of idleness and gossip, and that the brethren returned from them softened. Of course they did. It was a rest cure, and the whole institution had quietly agreed to pretend it was a medical procedure, because the rule made no provision for a holiday and the human body requires one. The system found a way. It always does. Picture a January afternoon in the infirmary then. It is one of the better rooms in the monastery, and it is warm, because the infirmary has a fire and a chimney, and the infirmarian has authority to keep it burning. There are beds along the wall. There are 3 or 4 old men who live here permanently now, because they are past the choir and past the stairs. And there are 8 who have been bled and are officially recovering, and there is a pot of something restorative on the hob, and it is raining, and the light through the window is the color of dishwater, and somebody is reading aloud from a book that is not Scripture. Because in the infirmary you were allowed a slightly wider range of reading, and there are chronicles and travelers' tales and lives of saints with dragons in them. And there is a cat, because there was always a cat. Cats appear in monastic accounts as a matter of routine, kept for the granary and the library and tolerated in the cloister, and there are wonderful marginal drawings of them, and at least one very famous poem written by an Irish monk about his cat and the pleasant symmetry of the 2 of them at work in the same room, the man hunting words and the cat hunting mice, each perfectly content and neither interfering with the other. That is January. That is more or less the whole of it. The bell, the psalms, the cold church, the warming house, the boots, the bleeding, the cat, the rain. At the beginning of February the year gives its first small signal, and the church marks it, and the mark is candles. The feast is the purification, 40 days after Christmas, and it has been called Candlemas in English for 1,000 years. And the ceremony is exactly what the name says. Candles are blessed. All the candles the house will use in the coming year, in principle, or at least a great symbolic quantity of them, are piled up and blessed at the beginning of the Mass, and then every member of the community is given one, lit, and they walk in procession round the cloister carrying them. Think about that image for a moment, because it is one of the loveliest in the medieval year. It is the beginning of February in the north of England. It is still dark at 7 in the morning, and it will be dark again by 5. The stone is running with condensation, and 40 men walk slowly round a square, in the covered walk, in single file, each carrying one small flame in his hands and shielding it with the other hand from the draught coming through the arcade. And the light goes round the four sides of the cloister, and you can follow it from any window in the building. And what it means, in the plainest terms, is that the dark half is over. Not that it is warm. It will not be warm for months. But the days are visibly longer than they were at Christmas, by an hour and more, and the ewes are beginning to show. And the shepherds out on the granges are watching them, and the whole enormous, slow machinery of the agricultural year is about to start turning again. There is an old country rhyme about Candlemas, in many versions, and the sense of all of them is that if the day is bright and fair, the winter has another half still to come, and if it is foul and gray, then the worst is already behind you, which is nonsense as weather forecasting and perfect as consolation, because it means that whatever the day is like, you can go inside feeling that it was good news. And then, sometime between the beginning of February and the middle of March, depending on where the moon falls, Lent begins and the house changes gear again. To understand Lent in a monastery, you have to first understand how these men ate for the rest of the year, so let us go and sit in the frater for a while. The frater, the refectory, the dining hall, is a long, high room off the south walk of the cloister, and in a well-built house, it is one of the handsomest spaces in the precinct, with tall windows down one side and a fine timber roof. The tables run down the two long walls, with the abbot's or the prior's table across the top end on a slightly raised dais. Everybody sits on one side of the table, facing inward across the floor so that nobody has his back to the room, and everybody can see the reader. Before they go in, they wash. There is a washing place in the cloister called the lavatorium or the laver. And it is often a beautiful piece of work, a long stone trough against the wall with a row of brass taps, or, in the grandest houses, a circular pavilion out in the middle of the cloister garth with water running all round it. Above it there is a recess for towels, and the towels are the refectorian's responsibility, and there are notes in the accounts about how often they are washed, which in the better houses is twice a week, and in the worse houses is a subject of complaint. They file in, they stand at their places, grace is said, and then everybody sits down, and the reader climbs the steps to the pulpit. The pulpit is built into the thickness of the wall halfway down the room, reached by a narrow stair inside the masonry, with a stone rail and a little desk. The reader is a monk appointed for the week, and he starts the week by asking the community to pray that God will keep him from pride in his own performance, and then he reads, and he goes on reading until the meal is over. He reads scripture, or a commentary, or a history, or the life of a saint, or one of the great long theological works that could take a year to get through at a chapter a day. And the community eats in silence, and signs for the salt, and listens or does not listen, and the sound in that room is the reader's voice and a small clatter of wooden bowls and horn spoons and nothing else at all. The servers move round with the dishes. The serving is done by the brethren themselves in a weekly rota, because the rule is emphatic that everybody serves and that nobody is excused unless he is ill or occupied with something more important, and that the weekly servers should begin and end their turn with a small ceremony in which they wash the feet of the community, and that the outgoing server and the incoming server each say a particular verse. The whole of it takes 10 minutes, and it is done every Saturday for 1,500 years. And what is in the bowls? Bread first. The basic ration is generous, and it is measured. 1.5 pounds of bread a day is a common allowance, sometimes 2 pounds, and the bread is usually maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye, dense and dark, baked in the house's own oven from grain grown on the house's own land and ground in the house's own mill. White bread appears on feasts. Then, pottage. This is the great constant of the medieval diet at every level of society, and it is essentially a thick vegetable soup or stew made in an enormous cauldron, based on whatever the garden and the store are producing. Beans and peas above all, dried by the sack and soaked overnight. Leeks, onions, cabbage, kale, root vegetables, though not the ones you would expect since there are no potatoes and no carrots as we know them, but there are parsnips and turnips and skirrets. Oatmeal or barley to thicken. Herbs, salt, and, on the days when it is allowed, a piece of bacon or a bone or some dripping to give it body, which is the difference between a good pottage and a penitential one. Then the pittance. This is the extra dish, the small addition, and the word survives in English as a word for a small amount, which tells you how small it was and also how much it mattered. A pittance might be a piece of fish, or an egg, or a little cheese, or a dish of beans dressed with butter, or on a feast, something considerably better. Pittances were very often paid for out of specific endowments, so that a benefactor might leave land to the house on condition that the income provided a pittance for the whole community on the anniversary of his death. Which means that on certain days of the year, the monks got a better dinner because a man who had been dead for 2 centuries had arranged it, and the reader would announce whose it was, and they would pray for him and eat it. Ale to drink. A gallon a day is a standard allowance, and it sounds astonishing until you remember that medieval small ale is weak. That it is the only reliably safe drink in a world without water treatment, and that it is also food, because it is essentially liquid bread and carries real nourishment. Wine in the houses that could afford it, and the rule has a wonderfully rueful passage about wine in which Benedict says that he really believes wine is not suitable for monks at all. But since the monks of his day cannot be persuaded of this, he will allow a measure, and he asks only that they do not drink to excess. You can hear the sigh in it across 1,400 years. 2 meals a day in summer, dinner in the middle of the day, and supper in the evening. 1 meal a day in winter and on fast days, taken in the afternoon. And then Lent, and everything narrows. For 40 days there is 1 meal, and it comes late after none, which is the middle of the afternoon, and in the strictest observance it comes after vespers, so that a man has eaten nothing at all from the moment he wakes at 2 in the morning until the light is already going in the evening. No cheese, no eggs, no milk or butter, no fat of any kind from an animal. No meat under any circumstances, in any house, however lax. Wine reduced or watered, the pittances stop, which leaves bread, ale, vegetables, and fish. Fish is the great Lenten subject, and it explains a striking amount of the medieval landscape. This is why every monastery of any size has a chain of fish ponds called stews dug in the valley below the buildings, stepped one above another with sluices between them so that they can be drained one at a time. This is why the cellars' accounts explode every February with entries for saltfish, herring by the barrel, and cod dried into boards that had to be beaten with a hammer before they could be soaked. This is why the house pays for a license to fish a stretch of river, and why a gift of eel rents from a fenland manor was a serious and valuable endowment, and why the monasteries of the fen country counted their income partly in tens of thousands of eels a year. The fish itself, on the plate at the end of a March afternoon after 12 hours of nothing, is a piece of salt cod, that has been soaked overnight and boiled, with a sauce made of vinegar and mustard, and bread and peas pottage without a scrap of bacon in it. And a monk who has done 30 Lents knows exactly what it is going to taste like before he sits down and eats it slowly and listens to the reading. Now, the meat. The rule is unambiguous. Benedict says that all shall abstain entirely from the flesh of four-footed animals, except the sick who are very weak. That is the law, and for the first 500 years it was more or less kept. And then, gradually, over centuries, it was not. And the way it came unstuck is such a perfect little study in how institutions bend that it is worth telling properly. It happened by rooms. The rule forbade meat in the refectory. It did not, strictly speaking, forbid meat everywhere, because it had not occurred to Benedict that anybody would eat anywhere else. But the infirmary served meat, legitimately, to the sick, and the abbot's lodging served meat to guests of rank, legitimately, because you cannot offer a visiting earl a bowl of peas, and the saintly house served meat to the men recovering from bloodletting. So a second dining room appears. It is called the Misericord, from the word for mercy, and it is a smaller hall, often next to the infirmary, where meat may be eaten. And at first only a few men eat there at a time, by rotation, and then rather more. And by the 14th century there are houses where half the community is in the Misericord on any given day, and the great freighter is half empty, and where the rota for eating meat is administered as carefully as the rota for reading. The papacy eventually gave up and legislated for reality. A constitution of the early 14th century permitted meat on 4 days a week outside the fasting seasons, provided that not more than half the community ate it at once, so that the refectory was never wholly abandoned, which is a compromise so beautifully bureaucratic that it could have been drafted last week. And the reformers hated it and wrote about it, and reforming abbots would arrive and close the Misericord and drive everybody back into the freighter, and it would hold for a decade or two, and then it would drift again. And that is the actual rhythm of monastic history, not decline and fall, but tide. In and out, reform and slackening and reform again, over and over for 1,000 years. But in Lent, none of it applies. In Lent, the Misericord shuts, and everybody eats in the freighter, and everybody eats fish, and the house is exactly what it says on the parchment for 40 days. There is one more Lenten custom, and it is the reason a great many of the books we still have exist at all. So let us go and sit in the cloister on the first Monday of Lent and watch it happen. The rule says that in Lent each brother is to receive a book from the library and is to read it through, entire, from beginning to end. And it says, with the practical suspicion that runs all the way through the document, that 1 or 2 senior brethren should be appointed to go round the cloister at the hours of reading and check that nobody is idling, or gossiping, or sitting there turning pages without taking anything in. So, on the first Monday of Lent, in most Benedictine houses, there is a ceremony, and it is one of the most attractive rituals in the whole calendar. The books are brought out of the book cupboard, which in most houses is literally a cupboard, an aumbrey recessed into the wall of the cloister next to the church door, with wooden doors and shelves and a lock. In the bigger houses by the 14th century, it has become a proper room, and later a proper library. But for most of the Middle Ages, the library of an English abbey lives in a cupboard in a corridor, and it holds somewhere between 50 and a few hundred volumes, which is a very great deal of money in a very small space. They are laid out on a carpet or a cloth on the floor of the chapter house or along the cloister walk. And then the librarian reads out the roll of the previous year, name by name, and each monk stands up and returns the book he was given last Lent. And here is the part I love. He has to say what he has done with it. If he has read it, he says so. If he has not read it, he says that too, in front of everybody, and the rule of the order says he is to prostrate himself and ask pardon. And the librarian notes it down, and he is very likely given the same book again. Then the new books are handed out, one to each man chosen by the librarian to suit him. And that is his book for the year, not to keep. To read slowly in the appointed hours in his corner of the north walk for 12 months. The reading itself has a name and a technique. It is called Lectio Divina, and it is not reading as we do it. It is slow to a degree that we would find almost unbearable. A few lines. Then stop. Then turn them over. Then say them under your breath, because medieval reading was very often done aloud, even when alone, and there are complaints in monastic customaries about the noise of the cloister at reading time. A low sustained murmur of 40 men muttering their way through 40 different books. Then go back and read the same lines again. A monk might get through a single page in a morning and consider it a good morning, and they read in the cloister, because the cloister is where the light is. The north walk is the favorite, because it faces south across the garth and gets the sun on the page. And in the better appointed houses there are carrels built along it, little wooden study booths partitioned off between the columns, each with a desk and a seat and a window in front of it, and a monk in a carrel on the north walk in March, with the sun coming in and a book in front of him, is about as close to comfort as the rule permitted anybody to get. Which brings us to the scriptorium, and to the making of the books themselves, and this is the part of monastic life that has stayed most vividly in the world's imagination, and rightly, because it is genuinely extraordinary. Start with the parchment, because everything follows from it. Parchment is skin, sheep, calf, or goat. It is made by soaking the hide in a bath of lime and water for a week or more until the hair loosens, scraping off the hair with a curved knife, stretching the wet skin on a frame with cords and pegs, and then scraping it again and again with a moon-shaped blade as it dries, thinning it, working it, until it is even and pale and flexible. Then it is dusted with chalk and rubbed with pumice to take the grease out and give it a surface that will hold ink. One skin makes a limited number of leaves. A large book is therefore a herd. A great Bible, made properly, with wide margins, might consume the skins of 200 animals or more, which is a flock, which is a farm. Which is why books cost what they cost and why they were chained to desks. The ink is made in the house. The standard medieval recipe is iron gall ink, and it is made from oak galls, those hard round growths that a wasp causes on an oak twig, crushed and steeped in rainwater or wine until the liquid draws out the tannin, then mixed with green vitriol, which is iron sulfate, at which point the whole thing turns black in front of you and thickened with gum arabic. It goes on to the page slightly brown and darkens to a deep black over the following days as it oxidizes, and it bites into the surface rather than sitting on it, which is why it has lasted 800 years and why you cannot scrape it off without taking the skin with it. The pen is a feather, and the best feathers are the outer flight feathers of a goose. From the left wing for a right-handed scribe because they curve away from the eye. It is hardened in hot sand, stripped, and cut with a small, sharp blade, which is where the word penknife comes from, and it needs recutting every page or two, and a scribe spends a noticeable fraction of his working day sharpening. The page is ruled before it is written, pricked along the margins with an awl to mark the line spacing, then ruled with a hard point that leaves a groove, or later with lead. Everything is measured. The width of the text block, the number of lines, the position of the initials, all of it worked out in advance, because you cannot insert a page later. And then he writes. And the phrase that appears again and again in the colophons, the little notes scribes left at the end of their work, is that writing is done with 3 fingers, but the whole body labors. They complain about their backs. They complain about their eyes. They complain about the cold and the dark, and the fact that the light goes at 3 in the afternoon in December and no candle may be brought near the parchment for fear of fire, which means that in a northern house the writing season is essentially March to October and the winter is for reading. Some of the notes at the ends of manuscripts are heartbreakingly ordinary. Now I have written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink. This page is badly written because the light was poor. Thank God it is finished. The parchment is hairy. Pray for the poor scribe. St. Patrick of Armagh, deliver me from writing. And some of them are simply a name and a date and nothing else, and that is the only trace that man left in the world. Then the decoration, which in a large house is a separate craft done by separate men. The colored initials, the running titles, in red, which is where the word rubric comes from, since red is ruber. And in the great books, the illumination proper, gold leaf laid on a raised ground of gesso and burnished with a dog's tooth until it throws light. And pigments ground on a stone slab from whatever the world could supply, green from copper, red from lead or from an insect, blue from woad, or, if the house was rich and the book was important, from lapis lazuli, which came overland from the mountains of what is now Afghanistan and was worth more by weight than gold, and which is why the Virgin's robe is blue in every medieval painting you have ever seen. It was the most expensive thing on the palette, so it went on the most important figure. And in the margins, where nobody official was really looking, the artists did whatever they liked. Rabbits with swords, snails fighting knights, a fox in a bishop's mitre preaching to geese, musicians with the heads of dogs, a man being swallowed by a fish, being swallowed by a larger fish. Monks in every conceivable undignified posture. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained the medieval margin, and the honest answer is probably that a man who has spent 11 months copying a commentary on the Book of Kings is going to draw a rabbit, and his superiors, who had all done the same job, let him. The whole thing is slow beyond modern comprehension. A single large book might take 1 man a year. A great Bible might take 3 men 3 years. And when it was done, it went into the cupboard in the cloister wall, and it was read at a page a morning, and it lasted 600 years, and some of them are still being read now. Lent runs on. The days lengthen visibly now, a couple of minutes each morning, and by the middle of it, the light is coming back at a rate you can feel. Snowdrops in the orchard, then celandines along the wall, then primroses on the bank above the fish ponds. The ewes are lambing out on the granges, and the lay brothers are sleeping in the fold in a shelter of hurdles and straw. The plow teams are out on the home fields as soon as the ground will take them. And inside the church, meanwhile, something rather beautiful has happened, which is that the whole east end has disappeared behind a curtain. The Lenten veil is one of those customs that has almost entirely vanished, and that everybody who hears about it wants to see. On the first day of Lent, a great cloth, plain and undyed, or in some houses painted with the instruments of the Passion, is hoisted on ropes across the church between the choir and the high altar. And there it stays for the whole of Lent, so that for 6 weeks the community sings the entire round of the office facing a wall of cloth and cannot see the altar at all. Other things are put away with it. The crosses are veiled or covered, the images are shrouded. The great joyful acclamation that ends most psalms in the office is dropped. In many houses the bells fall silent for the last 3 days and are replaced by a wooden clapper, a rattling board struck with a hammer, which makes a flat, unlovely noise, and after 5 weeks of no bells at all, that noise is the only signal in the building. You may think what you like about the theology. As stagecraft, it is astonishing. Take away, one by one, in the course of 6 weeks, every sensory pleasure the building offers: the gold, the color, the flowers, the sight of the altar, the sound of the bell, the taste of fat, the extra hour of sleep. Strip it back to bare stone and plain song and a curtain. And then, at the end, give it all back at once in the middle of the night. The last week of Lent is Holy Week, and the offices in it are the longest and most elaborate of the entire year, and they are also, oddly, the quietest. Palm Sunday opens it with the one great outdoor procession of the season. Branches are blessed, and in England, where there are no palms, the branches are willow or yew or box. And the whole community walks in procession out of the church and round the precinct and back in through the west door, singing, with the boys of the almonry school singing a hymn from somewhere up above, from a gallery or from the roof over the porch, so that the sound comes down out of the air. Then 3 days of gathering stillness, and then the office called tenebrae, which means darkness, and which is exactly what it sounds like. It is sung on the last 3 evenings. A stand is set up before the altar, carrying a row of candles, usually 15. The office is long, mostly psalms and the lamentations of Jeremiah, which are sung to a melody so old and so plain that it does not seem to have been composed by anybody. And after each psalm, 1 candle is put out. The office goes on for well over an hour, and the room grows steadily darker as it proceeds, and the darkening is so gradual that nobody notices it happening, and then, quite suddenly, there are only 3 candles left, and then 2, and then 1, and that last one is taken down and carried out of sight behind the altar, still burning, and the building is completely dark. And then there is a noise. In some houses, everybody strikes the wood of their stall with the flat of a hand. In others, a book is slammed shut, and the sound goes up into the vault and comes back down and dies away. And then the single candle is brought back out from behind the altar, still lit, and set on the stand, and everybody goes out in silence by the light of it. On the Thursday, there is the washing of feet, which is called the mandatum, from which we get the English word Maundy. The abbot, in an apron, with a basin and a towel, kneels and washes the feet of every monk in the house, one after another, and dries them and kisses them. And then, in most houses, he does it again, separately, for a number of poor men brought in from the gate for the purpose, and gives each of them food and a small sum of money and a garment. The number of poor men is usually tied to something: the age of the abbot, or the number of the apostles, or the number of years since the founding. And the almoner has been arranging it for a fortnight. On the Friday, the church is bare. The altars are stripped, the cloths gone, nothing on the stone at all. There is no Mass anywhere in Christendom on that day. The community comes in and goes up one at a time, barefoot, and kneels, and the thing that has been under the veil all this time is uncovered a little at a time and shown to them. And then, in the English use, there is a ceremony that is unique and rather moving, in which a cross and the sacrament are wrapped in linen and carried to a temporary structure at the side of the altar called the Easter Sepulchre, and laid in it and covered, and then a watch is kept over it, in shifts, by candlelight, all through Friday night and all through Saturday and into the small hours of Sunday morning. Somebody is always kneeling there, 2 hours each, in rotation through the night, so that from Friday afternoon until Sunday morning the church is never empty, and there is always one candle burning and one man awake beside it. Saturday is the strangest day in the year, because there is nothing. No office of any consequence, no Mass, no bells, no work, no decoration. The house is completely still. The kitchen makes almost nothing. The community reads or sits or walks in the cloister. It is a whole day of deliberate nothing, and the accounts of it from people who have lived through it agree that it is the longest day of the year, and also in a way that is difficult to put into words, the most restful. And then, in the dark of Saturday night, the great vigil. Every fire in the monastery has been put out. Every hearth, every lamp, every candle, including the perpetual one before the altar that has not gone out in years. The whole precinct is genuinely dark, from the gatehouse to the infirmary, for the first and only time. And in the yard outside the west door, a new fire is struck, flint and steel, on a piece of tinder in the cold, with everybody standing round in the dark. It catches, and it is blessed, and from it one enormous candle is lit, the paschal candle, the largest single object of wax the house will make all year, sometimes as tall as a man, and the sacrist has been preparing it since February. That one flame goes in through the west door into a black church, and everyone follows it, and as it goes down the nave the light is passed sideways. From the great candle to the small candles that everybody is holding, one to the next, all the way down the building, and the darkness fills up with light at walking pace. And a deacon stands and sings the great song of praise for the candle, which is one of the oldest and most extraordinary pieces of text in the Western Church, addressed half to God and half, quite literally, to a bee, thanking the bees for the wax and calling this night the one night that is worth all the others. Then the readings, which go on for a very long time. Walking backwards through the whole story from the making of the world onwards, in a building slowly filling with light. Then the water is blessed. Then, at last, close to dawn, the veil comes down. The bells are rung all together for the first time in 3 days. Everything that has been covered is uncovered. The great acclamation returns after 6 weeks of absence. And the community sings it at full strength while the sun comes up over the moor and comes in through the east window on to an altar that nobody in that room has seen since February. And then they go and have breakfast, and it has eggs in it and cheese and butter on the bread, and for the first time in 40 days a man may eat in the morning. Easter week is a holiday, the second of the 2 great slack weeks in the year, and after it the house turns outward, because from the end of April until the end of September the monastery is, before anything else, a farm. This is the part of monastic life that gets least attention and that took up most of the ground. A great abbey was one of the largest agricultural enterprises in the country. It held land in dozens of parishes, sometimes in several counties, given over 2 or 3 centuries by families who wanted their names read out in that cold room on a winter morning. And that land had to be worked, and the working of it was organized through granges. A grange is an outlying farm belonging to the house, run directly by the house rather than let to tenants. And in the Cistercian system, it is a very particular thing. It has its own barn, its own byres, its own workers' quarters, its own small chapel. It is run by a lay brother called the Grangiarius, the granger. It is placed within a day's travel of the mother house, which in practice means it is within about a dozen miles, so that the men on it can come in for the great feasts and the carts can come and go in a day. And there might be a dozen or 20 of them belonging to a single abbey, each specializing in whatever its ground was good for. So one grange is arable, on the good flat land in the valley bottom, growing wheat and rye and barley and oats and beans. Another is a sheep grange up on the moor edge, running a flock of 1,000 or 2,000. Another is a cattle grange with a dairy, called a vackery, making cheese and butter. Another is entirely given over to horses, breeding the workhorses the house needs. Another sits on a coal outcrop or an iron seam or a good bed of clay and is essentially an industrial site. And they are joined together by tracks that the house made itself, monks' roads, and by bridges the house built. And in the hill country of northern England, you can still walk long stretches of them. At the center of it all, at the mother house, is the great barn. The tithe barns and grange barns of the English monasteries are among the most beautiful buildings the Middle Ages produced, and they were built to hold grain. Some of them are over 200 feet long. They have stone walls 3 feet thick and enormous timber roofs of oak, cruck-framed or aisled, with the trusses marching away down the length of the building like the ribs of a whale. They have great porches on both sides so that a loaded cart can drive right in, be unloaded, and drive out the other end. And between the 2 doors is the threshing floor of beaten earth or elm boards, where the draught blows straight through from one open door to the other, which is exactly what you want when you are winnowing, because the wind takes the chaff away and the grain falls at your feet. Stand inside one on a summer afternoon, and it is one of the great architectural experiences available in England, and it was built to store beans. The farming year runs like this. In March and April, the plows are out. The heavy ox plow, 8 beasts to a team on the strong land, 4 on the lighter, turning the furrows slowly with a man at the handles and a boy walking beside the leaders with a goad. The house owns the oxen and breeds them and works them for 6 or 7 years, and then, at the end, eats them. Sowing follows the plow, broadcast by hand from a seed lip slung at the waist, the sower walking at a fixed pace and casting on the same foot every time so that the seed goes evenly, which is a skill that took years and that men were proud of. Then harrowing to cover it, and then the birds, and there are entries in the accounts for boys paid a penny or 2 a week to keep the crows off. May and June are the growing months, and the work turns to the garden, the orchard, the woods, and the water. The garden is the Infirmarius kingdom as much as the Kitchener's, because the medieval garden is half kitchen and half pharmacy. There is a plan of an ideal monastery from the 9th century, drawn on parchment and still in existence, that shows the whole thing laid out. And it has 3 gardens, a kitchen garden with 18 beds, a physic garden beside the infirmary with 16, and an orchard, which is also the cemetery, so that the monks are buried among the apple trees, and the trees do rather well. In the beds, leeks, onions, garlic, shallots, cabbage, kale, beans, peas, parsley, chervil, coriander, dill, fennel, celery, poppy, radish, lettuce. In the physic garden, sage, rue, iris, mint, rosemary, cumin, lovage, fenugreek, mallow, pennyroyal, tansy, wormwood, and above all sage, which the old rhyme says, the man who grows it in his garden need not die. And the herbs are not decorative. The infirmarian makes his medicines out of them, and he has books, and the books are copies of copies going back to the Greeks. Some of it works, and some of it does not. Willow bark for pain works, and we now know why. Honey on a wound works, and we now know why. Comfrey on a break works reasonably well. A great deal of the rest is theory built on the four humors and is entirely wrong, but it is administered with real care by a man who knows every patient by name and who will still be nursing him in 20 years. Then, the bees. Every house of any size keeps bees. In skeps of coiled straw set on a bench under the wall in a sheltered corner facing east or south, and the bees are the house's supply of two essentials. Wax for the candles, which we have already established is one of the great annual expenses. And honey, which is the only sweetener anybody has, because sugar comes from the eastern Mediterranean in small hard loaves and costs what saffron costs. And honey is also, once fermented, mead, which appears in the accounts of the northern houses regularly. Beekeeping, medieval style, is not beekeeping as it is now. There are no removable frames. To take the honey, you either drive the bees out with smoke or, more often, kill the colony with sulfur and cut the comb out. So the beekeeper's real skill is in reading which skeps are strong enough to overwinter and which should be taken, and there are treatises on it, and the monks were good at it, and there are lovely passages in medieval writing about the virtue of bees, which the Church held up as a model community. They work without argument, they obey without being driven, they make something sweet and something that gives light. And they do not, so the medieval writers firmly believed, reproduce, which made them the only chaste livestock in the world and therefore the ideal monastic animal. That last part is wrong in every particular, and they were completely committed to it. Then, the water, and this is where a monastery is genuinely centuries ahead of everybody around it. The stream comes down the valley, and before it reaches the buildings, it is taken and split. Part of it is led along a leat, a channel cut on a gentle contour, to the mill, where it turns the wheel that grinds the corn, and in a rich house there is a second mill for fulling cloth, and sometimes a third working a forge hammer. Part of it goes to the fish ponds, stepped one below another. Part of it is piped in lead pipes or hollowed elm trunks from a spring on the hillside, sometimes from a mile away, brought under the wall into a settling tank. And from there to the laver in the cloister, the kitchen, the brewhouse, and the infirmary. And then, having done all its useful work, it is taken along the back of the reredoter, the latrine block, which is deliberately built over a channel of running water so that the whole thing flushes continuously into the stream below the precinct. There are drawings of these systems. There is a famous one from Canterbury, drawn in the 12th century, showing the pipes and the tanks and the taps in careful detail, with the water running through the whole priory like blood through a body. Nobody in England outside a monastery had plumbing like that for another 500 years. The monks had it because they had to wash before every meal, and because they had a whole community in one place and no way of moving away from their own waste, and because they were the only people in the country with the money, the mathematics, and the institutional patience to build something that would take 20 years to finish. By the middle of May, the summer horarium has come in, and the day changes shape entirely. The rule provides for 2 arrangements, a winter one and a summer one, and the changeover happens at Easter and again at the end of September. In summer, when the nights are short, the community rises rather earlier by the clock, sings the night office in a much shorter darkness, and then, instead of going back to bed, goes out. The main manual work of the day is done in the cool of the morning, between lauds and terce, when the dew is still on the grass and the light is coming in low and long across the fields. And then, in the heat of the middle of the day, after dinner, there is a thing that the rule specifically provides for and that is very easy to miss on a first reading. And it is one of the humane touches that make Benedict such good company. There is a rest. He says that from Easter until the middle of September, after the midday meal, the brethren may lie down on their beds and sleep, and that anybody who prefers to read instead may do so, but that he must read in such a way as not to disturb anybody else. A siesta, written into the constitution of Western monasticism in the 6th century and kept for 1,000 years, on the perfectly sensible grounds that if a man is going to get up at 2 in the morning, he is going to need a lie-down at 2 in the afternoon. So the Dorter, in the middle of a June afternoon, is a warm, quiet room, with the sun coming through the small windows and dust in the light and 30 men asleep in their clothes on straw mattresses. And outside the swifts are going round the tower screaming, and in the cloister below 1 or 2 are reading and turning pages as gently as they can. Then the bell for none, and a second working stretch which runs into the evening, because the light in June in the north of England goes on until nearly 10. And there is a great deal to do, because June and July are hay and wool. The hay comes first. All those oxen and horses and cows have to eat through 5 months of winter. And the only way to feed them is to cut the meadows and dry the grass and stack it. This is the hardest and most anxious work of the year after harvest itself, because it depends completely on the weather, and English weather in June does what it likes. You cut, and then you need 3 or 4 dry days to turn it and dry it, and if the rain comes in the middle, you can lose the lot to mold. And then the beasts starve in February. So when the weather is right, everybody goes. The rule expects it. Benedict says plainly that if local conditions or poverty require the brethren to labor at gathering the harvest themselves, they should not be sad about it, for then they are truly monks when they live by the labor of their hands as the fathers did. And there are records from many houses of the entire community, including the choir monks, including in some cases the abbot, going out to the meadows for the duration, and of the offices being shortened or set in the field so that the work is not interrupted. Picture that. 30 men in tucked-up habits with size, in a line across a meadow, moving together in the long, swinging rhythm that mowing requires, each one a pace behind and to the left of the man in front so that nobody is cut, working from the dawn while the dew is still on, because grass mows better wet. Women and children from the village behind them with rakes, turning the swathes. Somebody sharpening, somebody bringing ale, The smell of cut grass, which is the smell of a plant dying, and which is the best smell in the world. And in the middle of it a small bell going somewhere for the office, and the whole line stopping, and 30 men saying a psalm in a hayfield with their hats off, and then picking up the scythes again. Then, at the end of June, the wool. And here we have to stop and take this seriously, because wool is the reason the English monasteries were rich. And it is the reason the Cistercians in particular changed the landscape of the north of England permanently. And it is a genuinely global story that begins with a sheep on a Yorkshire moor and ends in a weaving shed in Flanders and a counting house in Florence. Sheep suited the northern houses because the land they had been given was land nobody else wanted. Moor, fell, rough grazing, marsh edge. You cannot plow it. You can put sheep on it. And the Cistercians, with their enormous disciplined lay brother workforce and their granges, could run flocks at a scale nobody else could touch. A single great abbey might shear 10 or 15,000 sheep in a season. One or two of the biggest handled considerably more. The shearing itself happens in late June and early July after the sheep have been washed, which is done by driving the flock through a pool dammed in a stream and then left a few days for the grease to rise again, because wool shears better with a little grease in it. The shears are a single piece of steel bent into a U with 2 blades, sprung, worked with one hand, and a good man can do dozens in a day. The fleece comes off in one piece if he is skilled, and is rolled and thrown, and the wool is then sorted, and the sorting is where the money is. Because wool is not wool, it is graded. There is the fine wool from the shoulders and the sides. There is coarser wool from the belly and the breech. There are locks and clippings. There is wool from lambs and wool from old ewes, and wool that has been rained on, and wool with burrs in it. And the great buyers knew exactly what they were buying. And the whole trade ran on trust, on the reputation of individual houses, and on grading standards so well established that Italian merchants kept written lists of every English monastery worth dealing with, ranked by the quality of its clip with the price per sack for each. Those lists survive. There is one compiled by a Florentine merchant house in the early 14th century that names something like 200 English religious houses, gives the grade of their wool, good, middling, and coarse, and gives the price. The best of it, from a handful of houses in Shropshire and the Welsh March and Yorkshire, commanded prices 2 or 3 times what the poorest fetched. And the merchants came. They came up from London, and they came from Flanders, and above all they came from Italy, and they rode into the outer courts of remote Yorkshire abbeys in the summer, and were housed in the guest hall and given the best the kitchen could do, and they sat down with the cellarer and bought the clip. And then they bought next year's clip. And the year after. And in some cases, the clip for the next 15 years paid for in advance. That is the point at which a peaceful agricultural story turns into something more complicated. Because selling forward is borrowing, and borrowing against a crop you have not grown yet is a way of getting into trouble that has been ruining farmers for a very long time. A house that needed money to build a new church or to pay a royal tax or to recover from a bad year would sell wool forward, and then there would be a hard winter or a murrain in the flock, and the wool would not be there, and the merchant would be owed, and the house would have to buy wool on the open market to cover the contract at a loss and sell forward again to pay for that. Several great English abbeys got themselves into extremely serious debt exactly this way in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. There are records of houses with debts running to thousands of pounds at a time when a laborer earned a couple of pence a day. There are royal commissions appointed to take houses into administration and run them until they were solvent. There are abbots resigning over it. It is a very human sequence, and it is not a scandal, it is arithmetic. A community that had taken a vow of personal poverty had accidentally become a corporation with a cash flow problem. And the two things sat side by side in the same cloister without ever quite looking at each other. But most years it was simply a good, sound, deeply satisfying trade. The sacks went off in carts, weighed and sealed and marked, down the monks' roads to the nearest navigable river or port, and the money came back, and it paid for the lead on the roof, and the glass in the windows, and the wine, and the wax, and the lapis for the blue in the great Bible. And it built those enormous churches whose ruins now stand in fields in Yorkshire with sheep grazing between the piers, which is a piece of circularity so neat that it hardly needs pointing out. And after the shearing, the wool that the house kept for itself goes to the chamberlain, because he has to clothe 40 men and provide their bedding, and that means it has to be sorted, washed, carded or combed, spun, woven, fulled at the fulling mill by the stream, tented and stretched on frames in a field to dry, sheared of its nap, and cut and sewn. Some houses did all of that themselves, most did some of it and bought in the rest. And every stage appears in the rolls in careful pounds and shillings and pence, so that we can still read exactly what it costs to keep a monk in a habit in the year 1340, which is a strange and rather touching thing to be able to know. Summer is also the season of visitors, and this is where the wall gets a door in it and where the monastery meets the world. The rule on this is one of the most quoted sentences in the whole document, and it is worth hearing exactly. All guests who arrive are to be received as Christ, because he himself will say, "I was a stranger, and you took me in." And it goes on to say that the greatest care and concern is to be shown in receiving the poor and pilgrims, because in them Christ is more truly welcomed, since the rich carry their own welcome with them by the very fear that people have of them. That last clause is one of the sharpest observations in the book. The rich do not need your hospitality, because everybody is already frightened of them. Look after the other lot. In practice, a monastery received an enormous quantity of traffic, and it was not optional, and it was not always pleasant. In a country with no hotels, no police, no signposts, and very bad roads, the religious houses were the infrastructure. If you were traveling, you stopped at an abbey. If you were a pilgrim, you stopped at an abbey. If you were a bishop, a judge, a royal messenger, a merchant, a beggar, a scholar, or a man walking to see his sister in the next county, you stopped at an abbey. The house fed you and gave you a bed and asked nothing, which means the guest master is a busy man. He has the guest hall near the gate, and depending on the wealth of the house, it might be a single long room with a fire and straw pallets, or it might be a substantial building with private chambers, stabling for 40 horses, and a separate kitchen. There is a rota of servants under him. There is a standing order with the cellarer for provisions. And he has to make instant judgments about rank, because the guest hall is sorted by status. A great lord and his retinue go to the abbot's own lodging. A country knight goes to the good chamber. A merchant goes to the common hall. A pilgrim on foot goes to the poor men's lodging and gets bread and ale and a place by the fire and a bed of straw, and on the following morning goes on his way. The rule adds a small, careful instruction which tells you a lot. The kitchen for the abbot and the guests is to be separate from the community's kitchen, so that guests arriving at odd hours, and there are always guests, do not disturb the brethren. The community's dinner is not to be delayed because a party of horsemen has turned up at 4 in the afternoon. That is not coldness. That is a man who has learned the hard way that a rhythm which can be interrupted is not a rhythm. Meanwhile, at the other end of the same wall, at the almonry, the poor are being fed, and this is the part of the operation that we most consistently underestimate. Every scrap of food left on the tables in the freighter goes into a basket and out to the almonry. Every loaf that is a day old. The dole is given at the gate on fixed days, and on certain anniversaries it is enormous because benefactors endowed it. A man leaving land to the abbey might specify that on the anniversary of his death, forever, 100 poor people are to be given a loaf and a herring and a farthing, and the almoner has to make it happen, and he does every year for as long as the house stands. And then there are the permanent poor, the Corodians and the beadsmen, old servants and old tenants and old soldiers who have been granted a place, a bed, a daily loaf and a gallon of ale for life, sometimes by charity, sometimes because they or their family paid for it in advance, which made it the closest thing the Middle Ages had to a pension. There are hundreds of these agreements written out on parchment, and they are extremely specific. So many loaves of this quality, so much ale, a dish from the kitchen, 2 robes a year, firewood, and a chamber near the gate, and in some of them the right to keep a horse, and in one wonderful example the right to have his ale brought to him rather than fetch it. Whether it was a good system is a fair question. It was patchy, it depended entirely on the character of the house, and the wealthier abbeys were sometimes criticized for spending far less on alms than their income warranted. But it existed everywhere, at every gate, without means testing and without paperwork, and when it was swept away in the 16th century, the country discovered rather abruptly that it had had a welfare system and no longer did. And there is one more group at the gate, and they are the ones with nowhere else to go, and that brings us to the infirmary. The infirmary stands slightly apart, usually to the east of the main buildings, with its own small cloister, its own chapel, and its own kitchen. It has a fire. It has, in most houses, the best rooms in the precinct after the abbot's, because a sick man cannot be expected to lie in a stone dormitory in February. The rule is exceptionally warm on this subject. Before all things, and above all things, care is to be taken of the sick, so that they may be served as if they were Christ himself. And in the very next breath, because Benedict is nothing if not realistic about human beings, he tells the sick that they must not distress those who serve them by making unreasonable demands, and that they must be borne with patiently, because greater merit is gained from them. There are baths in the infirmary, which is worth mentioning because everybody assumes the medieval world was filthy. The rule says that the use of baths is to be offered to the sick as often as is useful, but that to the healthy, and especially to the young, it should be granted more rarely. So bathing is understood to be a treatment and a comfort rather than a routine, and the healthy monk washes his hands and face daily at the laver, washes his feet regularly, and has a full bath a handful of times a year, usually before the great feasts, with the water heated in the kitchen and carried in. Meat is permitted here, as we have said. Wine is more freely given. Talking is allowed. The offices are shortened or omitted. A monk who has spent 40 years unable to speak in the cloister and unable to sleep past 2 in the morning arrives in the infirmary and finds that all of it has been quietly lifted. And most of them arrive here in the end, because a monastery kept its old men. There was nowhere else for them to go. A man who entered at 20 and lived to 70 spent his last decade or 15 years in a slow retreat, first excused the night office, then excused the stairs, then given a stall near the door, then moved to the infirmary permanently. And he is looked after by men he has known since they were novices and whose faults he has heard confessed in chapter every morning for half a century. They knew a good deal about care and almost nothing about cure. The infirmarian could set a bone, dress a wound, treat a fever with cool cloths and rest, give something for pain, and above all, keep a man clean, warm, fed, and not alone, which is a large part of nursing and always has been. Beyond that, he had the 4 humors, which were wrong, and bloodletting, which mostly did not help, and a herb garden, which sometimes did. The great houses often had a hospital as well, quite separate, out by the gate or in the nearest town, for the sick poor and for travelers. And some of the oldest hospitals in England began exactly this way, as a monastic foundation with a hall, a chapel at one end, so that the patients could see the altar from their beds, and a handful of brothers and sisters to run it. And when a monk is dying, the whole house is called. The board is struck, the signal that means, "Come now." And it is one of the few sounds in a monastery that everybody obeys instantly, regardless of what they are doing. The community comes from the fields, from the cloister, from the scriptorium, and they gather round the bed, and they say the psalms, and they go on saying them, in relays if it takes a long time, so that no monk in a Benedictine house dies in a quiet room. He dies in the middle of the noise he has been making himself for 50 years, with every voice in it that he knows. In many houses he is lifted, at the very end, off the bed and onto a piece of sacking or a bed of ashes strewn in the shape of a cross on the floor at his own request, made years earlier, so that he leaves the world in the same posture of poverty in which he took his vows. Then he is washed and dressed in his habit and his cowl and carried into the church, and there is a watch and there is a vigil, and the following day he is buried in the cemetery among the apple trees, without a coffin in the earlier centuries, wrapped in the cowl, with a small stone or nothing at all to mark it, and his name goes into the necrology. And on that day, every year afterwards, for as long as there is anybody in that valley to read it, his name will be read aloud in the chapter house before breakfast, and 40 men who never met him will pray for him for a moment, and then get on with the day. That is the deal. That is what stability buys you. Not fame, not a monument, not to be remembered as a person. Since nobody in the room after 50 years will have the faintest idea who you were. Just a name read out, in the cold, forever, by people who are also going to be read out. We have talked a great deal about what these men did and hardly at all about what the place sounded like, and since sound is the medium the whole institution worked in, let us fix that before we go back out into the fields. The singing is plainchant, and it is worth saying clearly what plainchant is and is not, because most people have heard it without ever being told. It is a single line of melody, one tune sung by everybody at once, in unison, with no harmony underneath it and no instrument playing along. There is no organ in most houses, and where there is one it is used for a few particular moments and not to accompany the voices. There is no beat. That is the thing people notice first and cannot quite name. There is no pulse in it, no 1, 2, 3, 4, nothing you could tap your foot to. The rhythm comes entirely from the words, from the natural length of the Latin syllables, and the line rises and falls and comes to rest according to the sense of the sentence rather than according to a bar, which means that 40 men have to breathe together without a conductor and without a count. And the only way that can possibly work is if all of them have sung the same thing several thousand times. They had. That is exactly what the Psalter in a week produces. A monk of 30 years standing does not read the chant. He does not think about the chant. The chant simply comes out of him at the correct speed with the correct pauses because his body learned it in his 20s and has been rehearsing it 8 times a day ever since. The sound of it in a big stone church is the other half of the story. A medieval abbey church has a very long reverberation, 3 or 4 seconds, sometimes more. That is a disaster for speech, and it is why the reader at the lectern has to go so slowly. But for a single unaccompanied line, moving in steps, it is perfect, because every note hangs in the air just long enough to still be there underneath the next one, so that the building supplies a kind of ghost harmony that nobody is singing. The men are singing a line, the room is singing a chord, and the buildings were tuned, not deliberately in any way we could measure, but by trial and error over centuries, by masons who knew from experience what worked, where the choir stalls sat, how high the vault went, whether the east end was flat or apsed, how much timber and how much cloth and how many bodies were in the space. All of it changed the sound, and all of it was noticed. The notation is worth a moment, too. Early chant was not written down at all. It was carried in memory, and the whole repertoire of the Western Church, thousands of melodies, existed for centuries entirely inside people's heads. Then somebody began writing little marks above the words to remind the singer of the shape up here, down there, a curl, a turn. They are called neumes, and they do not tell you the pitch, they only tell you the direction, so they are useless unless you already know the tune, which of course you did. Then, in the 11th century, a monk in Italy had the idea of drawing lines across the page and putting the marks on and between them so that the exact pitch could be shown. And with that one invention, it became possible for a man to sing a melody he had never heard before from a page correctly. That is one of the most consequential things anybody has ever done. And it was done in a monastery by a music teacher who was tired of how long it took to train boys. Because there were boys. Not the child oblates of the earlier centuries, but in many houses, an almonry school, a small group of boys taken in and fed and taught, who sang in the church and served at the altar and got an education that would otherwise have been completely out of reach. And some of whom stayed and became monks, and some of whom went off into the world as clerks and lawyers and priests. They lived under the almoner rather than in the cloister proper. They were fed from the alms, and they were beaten when they got it wrong. Because everybody was, and the surviving instructions to their masters are a strange mixture of severity and real tenderness. Do not let them go out alone. Do not let them be idle. See that they have shoes. Do not strike them in anger, and never on the head. Their voices, high and clear, coming down out of a gallery into a building full of men's voices, are a sound that has now completely vanished from most of the world, and that anybody who has been inside an English cathedral at evensong will recognize instantly, because it is the one piece of the whole apparatus that survived intact. And around all the singing there is the rest of the noise, or rather the rest of the not very much. The bell, obviously, which is the loudest man-made thing in the valley and can be heard for 2 or 3 miles on a still day, and which everybody outside the wall uses as a clock as well, so that the plowman on the far side of the hill knows what time it is because the monks told him. The board struck with a mallet for the summons to a death, the clapper of wood in Holy Week, feet on stone, doors, the small, unavoidable clatter of eating with wooden and horn utensils, which is why the reader has to be loud. The stream, all the time, everywhere, at a different volume depending on the weather, so that the men in that valley could tell you whether it had rained on the moor last night without going outside. The mill wheel, when the sluices open, a heavy, slow slap. The forge, if the smith is working. Cattle, sheep, distantly, a great many of them. Geese, who were kept everywhere, and who make an appalling racket, and who functioned as an alarm system. Rooks in the elms by the gate, morning and evening, in enormous numbers. Rain on a lead roof, which is a very particular and very good sound. Wind in a building with that much glass and that many gaps, which is less good and which is in the complaints. And underneath all of it, for a very large part of the day, a silence that we now have almost no experience of. Not quiet. Silence, no machinery anywhere in the world within earshot. No engine within 50 miles because there is no engine. Nothing in the sky. On a still night in January in that valley, standing in the cloister. A man could hear a dog barking in a village 2 miles away, and the stream and his own heart, and that was the entire contents of the audible world. It is very difficult for us to imagine, and it is probably the single biggest difference between their day and ours, bigger than the food or the cold or the belief. They lived inside a silence that we would find frightening. And then 8 times a day they filled it with 40 voices singing one line together in a stone box, and then they let it go quiet again. But we are not there yet. It is still summer, and the corn is standing, and the whole valley is waiting on the weather. The first day of August is Lammas, which is Loaf Mass, and it is the oldest harvest festival in the English calendar. A loaf is baked from the first of the new corn, the very first sheaf cut and threshed and ground in a hurry so that it can be on the altar on the day, and it is blessed at Mass. In many places, the loaf was then broken into 4 pieces, and the pieces put in the 4 corners of the barn to keep the grain that would shortly fill it. That is not in any liturgical book. That is what people actually did. And then the harvest, and for 4 or 5 weeks the monastery stops being a monastery in any sense that would be recognizable from the outside. Everybody works. The choir monks, the lay brothers, the servants, the tenants who owe labor service, and hired hands from 3 parishes round, who are paid in cash and in food, and who eat better during harvest than at any other time of the year, because everybody knows that a man swinging a sickle from dawn to dark needs feeding, and that this is not the moment to be careful with the bacon. The reaping is done with the sickle, a short curved blade, and it is done bent double, gathering a handful of stalks in the left hand and cutting them low with the right, over and over all day. It is famously brutal work. It is also done in the strip fields and on the Abbey's own demesne by long rows of people working across the field together, which is the only thing that makes it bearable, because it turns an intolerable individual task into a social event with a rhythm and a bit of singing in it, Behind the reapers, the binders, tying the cut corn into sheaves with a twist of straw. Behind them, the stookers, standing the sheaves up in little tents of 8 or 10, so that the wind gets through and dries them. Then, after a few days, the carts and the loading and the long, slow haul down the lane to the great barn with a boy sitting on top of the load. And, after the carts have gone, the gleaners. This is the poor of the parish, mostly women and children, who have the right to go over the stubble and pick up every ear the harvesters missed. It is an ancient right, older than the church in England, and it is written into Scripture, and it was defended fiercely, and a family that gleaned well through a good harvest might gather enough grain to matter through the winter. There are records of the church court fining people for gleaning before the carts had cleared, which tells you both that it was a serious right and that people were understandably impatient about it. The offices go on, but they are compressed. There are customaries that specifically allow the community to say a shortened office during harvest, or to say it in the field, and one that says that if the weather is turning, the brethren may be dispensed altogether and make it up afterwards, which is a sentence you have to read twice. Even the machine for producing continuous prayer will pause for 3 dry days in August. The corn will not wait, and the corn is how everybody eats until next August, and the rule was written by a man who understood that. At the end there is a harvest supper, and it is in the accounts of nearly every English manor and abbey, and the entries are lovely because they are so plainly generous. Meat, white bread. Cheese, ale in quantity. In some places, a goose. And it is paid for by the Lord, which here means the abbey, and everybody who worked eats it, and the monks eat it with them, and for one evening the difference between inside the wall and outside the wall goes quiet. Then the threshing, which is the winter work going on in the barn from October right through to March. The flail, 2 sticks joined by a leather hinge, swung over the head and brought down on the ears, spread on the floor. 2 or 3 men working together in a rhythm so that the flails do not collide, which sounds like a slow drum and which you can hear from the lane. Then the winnowing, tossing the threshed heap into the air on a broad, shallow basket in the drought between the 2 open doors. So the chaff blows off and the heavy grain falls back, then into sacks, then up to the granary on its staddlestones where a cat lives. September brings the fruit, and the orchard is one of the pleasantest corners of the precinct. Apples above all in varieties whose names have almost all been lost, mostly small and hard and sharp by our standards. Pears, plums, and damsons. Medlars, which have to be left until they are half rotten before they are worth eating, and which everybody in the Middle Ages seems to have been very fond of. Quinces in the south. Nuts from the hazel hedges gathered by the sackful and stored. And the apples mostly become cider, in the west and south at least, pressed in a great screw press, or crushed under a stone wheel drawn round a circular trough by a horse, and the cider goes into barrels in the cellarer's undercroft and is drunk through the winter. And then the last day of September and Michaelmas, which is the hinge of the whole administrative year. Michaelmas is when the accounts are made up. Every obedientiary in the house rules a fresh membrane of parchment and writes up his year, and the rolls go to the abbot and the seniors and are audited line by line. And the auditing is real. There are surviving rolls with corrections in the second hand and marginal notes querying an item. And in a few splendid cases a note in the margin saying that this expenditure was not authorized and is disallowed. which is a thing an auditor wrote on a piece of sheepskin 700 years ago, and which anybody who has ever submitted an expense claim will recognize instantly. Michaelmas is also when rents fall due, when tenancies begin and end, when servants are hired for the year, when the bailiffs of the granges come in to render their accounts, and when the outer court is fuller than at any other time except harvest, with carts and horses and men waiting to be seen, and a queue outside the cellarer's door. And it is the season of the visitation, which is the one moment in the year when the house is inspected from outside. Depending on the order, the visitor is the bishop, or the abbot of the mother house, or in the Cistercian system, a party from the abbey that founded this one. Since every Cistercian house was in a family tree, and the parent had a duty to visit the daughter annually. He arrives, he is received in state, and then he does something quite unnerving. He interviews every single member of the community separately and in private, from the prior down to the youngest novice, and asks each of them whether anything is wrong. The records of these visitations survive in bulk, and they are the single best source we have for what actually went on inside these places, because they are a list of complaints. And the complaints are wonderfully, reassuringly small. The bell is rung late. The cloister is noisy. The younger monks talk during the reading. The kitchen sends up the same dish too often. The infirmary roof leaks. The prior favors his relations. The Cini house is being used too freely. The accounts have not been shown to the community for 3 years. There is not enough bedding. The freighter doors do not shut, and the draught is intolerable. The wine is watered. Brothers, somebody keeps a dog. There are women coming into the guest hall who ought not to be there. The abbot has not slept in the dormitory since anybody can remember. Occasionally there is something serious, and when there is, the visitor deals with it, and the record of that survives too. But the overwhelming majority of it is exactly what you would expect from any group of human beings who have lived in the same building for decades, and reading it is oddly comforting. 9/10 of a monastic scandal is a draught. A dog and a dish of the same fish for the 4th time this week. The visitor writes his injunctions. The doors are to be mended before the Feast of All Saints. The accounts are to be rendered annually in chapter. The brethren are to observe silence in the cloister. The dog is to go. And then he rides away, and things improve for a while, and then they drift. Because they always drift. And he will be back next year. October turns, and the year begins its long slide back down into the dark, and the work of the house turns entirely to laying things by. The pigs go into the woods. This is called pannage, and it is one of the great sensible arrangements of the medieval economy. From about the end of September until the end of November, the oak and beech woods are dropping acorns en masse, and pigs will eat acorns with tremendous enthusiasm and turn them into fat. So the swineherd drives them up into the woods, and they live there, half wild, fattening for nothing, and the right to send a given number of pigs into a given wood for those weeks was a valuable thing that was written into charters and argued over in court. The oaks themselves are also being looked at, because timber is the other crop of a wood, and it is a crop on a scale that only an institution can think about. A monastery plants oaks, not for itself. Obviously, an oak good enough for a roof truss is 150 years old at the very least, and for the great timbers of a barn or a church roof, you want 200. So the man who puts in the acorns is planting for the 5th generation of monks after him, none of whom he will meet, on the entirely reasonable assumption that the house will still be there and will still need a roof. That is the single clearest illustration of what stability does to a mind. Everybody in that valley was working on time scales that no individual could see the end of. And it did not strike them as strange, and the trees they planted became the roofs that stood over the men who planted the trees that became the next roofs, and in some places in England you can still stand under the result. Then, in the middle of November, comes Martinmas, and Martinmas is the killing. There is not enough fodder to keep every beast through the winter. There never is. So at Martinmas, the decision is made about which animals go into the spring and which do not. And the ones that do not are slaughtered over a few days, and then the entire precinct turns into a preserving operation. Salting above all. The meat is cut up and packed into barrels in layers with coarse salt between, and salt is therefore one of the most important things the cellarer buys all year. In quantity hauled inland from the coastal salt pans or from the witches of Cheshire, where brine springs were boiled down over fires. Bacon flitches are salted and then hung in the smoke of the kitchen roof. Sausages are made with the offcuts. The blood is used. The fat is rendered down for tallow, which we have met already, and for cooking. The hides go to the tannery, which is why the tannery is downwind, because tanning involves oak bark, urine, and a great deal of standing water, and the smell of it is one of the reasons monasteries put it as far from the cloister as the wall allowed. Nothing is thrown away. There is a phrase in the accounts of many houses for the man who deals with the offal and the odds and ends. And the whole system is designed on the assumption that every part of an animal is worth something to somebody, which was true, and which we have only recently unlearned. And through November, the fires start again. The warming house is lit on the Feast of All Saints, at the beginning of the month, and from that day the community has somewhere to stand, which brings us round at the very beginning of November to the 2 days that hold the whole memory of the place. All Saints on the 1st, and All Souls on the 2nd. All Souls is the great commemoration of the dead, and in a monastery it is enormous. The whole necrology is read, not just today's names, but everybody, every monk of the house who ever died, back to the foundation, every abbot, every benefactor and every benefactor's family, every servant, every member of the confraternity, which is to say every layman who is admitted to a share in the prayers of the house in return for a gift. It takes a long time. In an old house it takes a very long time, and the reading of it is shared out. And a monk standing in his stall on the 2nd of November in the year 1350 is listening to names of men who died in 1140, whose faces nobody alive has ever seen, whose handwriting is in the book cupboard, whose oaks are holding up the roof over his head. There are processions to the cemetery, and the graves are blessed, and it is usually raining, because it is the north of England in November. And then Advent again, and the wheel has come round, and we are back where we started, in the dark with the lantern coming down the dormitory. That is the year. That is all of it. Nothing happened. A boy became a novice, an old man died, a roof was mended, a wool contract was signed, a book was copied about a third of the way through, 150 psalms were sung 52 times over, and the whole thing is about to start again on Sunday. And it did start again, over and over. In some English valleys for 400 years, without a break, in a few for very much longer. Until the 16th century, when it stopped quite suddenly, in the space of about 4 years, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with anything we have talked about tonight. We are not going to go into that. Not tonight. It is not the kind of story this is, and it is certainly not the kind of story to fall asleep to. All that needs saying is that the roofs came off, and the lead went to the king's foundries, and the glass went, and the stone was carted away for barns and field walls and gateposts, and within a century most of these places were what they are now, which is a beautiful, roofless shape standing in a field with sheep in the nave. And the strange thing, the thing that anybody who has walked round one of them will tell you, is that they are still restful. Whatever it was that these places were built to do, some of it seems to have soaked into the ground, and it is still there on a wet afternoon in Yorkshire with nobody about and a stream going past exactly where it always went. So let us go back for one last time and put the year to bed and go round the buildings in the dark on a night at the beginning of December, the way we came in. The church is empty. The great candles are out. There is one small light burning before the altar, as there always is, and the sacrist has trimmed it, and it throws a very small circle of warm color on the stone, and nothing beyond that. The choir stalls are empty, and the misericord seats are all tipped up. Somewhere up in the roof a bird is asleep in the timbers. The Lenten veil is folded in a chest. The Paschal candle from Easter is a stump and will be melted down. The cloister is empty. The carols along the north walk have their desks bare, because the books have been put back in the cupboard for the night, and the cupboard is locked. There is frost forming on the grass in the square in the middle. The water in the laver has stopped moving and is holding a piece of the sky. The chapter house is empty and cold, with its stone bench running all the way round the wall, and the abbot's seat, and the flat worn place in the middle of the floor. The frater is empty. The tables are wiped. The reader's pulpit halfway down the wall is dark, and the book that was being read at dinner is shut and left on the desk at the place where he stopped, and tomorrow he will start again from there. In the kitchen, the fire is banked under ash so that it can be woken in the morning without striking a light. In the warming house, the same, and the boots are standing in a row along the wall, greased. In the great barn, the grain is in, and the threshing floor is swept, and the cat is somewhere up in the roof. In the granary, the year's food, measured in the fish ponds, the water is black and absolutely still, and the fish are down in the mud. In the woods, the pigs have gone home, and the oaks are bare, and the acorns that are going to be roof timbers in the 1600s are lying in the leaf litter waiting for a squirrel to forget them. In the infirmary, one fire is still in, and there are 4 old men asleep, and the infirmarian is awake in a chair with a blanket over his knees, and he will doze. At the gate, the porter's lamp is burning, and will burn all night, because somebody is always there. And in the dorter, 40 men are asleep in their clothes in a long stone room with no fire and no ceiling, under blankets and cloaks, in 2 rows, in the order in which they arrived, with their boots by their beds. And in about 3 hours a man will come along that room with a lantern, and it will all begin again. So let us go round it one last time, more slowly, and let it get further away as we go. There is a bell rope hanging in a dark tower with nobody on the end of it. There is a stair with a hollow worn into the middle of every tread, coming down out of a dormitory into the north transept of a church. And it has been worn by soft shoes going down it in the dark twice a night for 200 years, and there is nobody on it now. There is a candle, marked in bands, burning down slowly on a ledge, and a man asleep in a chair beside it who will wake before it reaches the mark, because he always does. There is a psalter open on a lectern at the page where it was left, and it will be turned to the next page in the morning, and when the last page is turned, they will go back to the first one and start again, as they have done every week for as long as anybody can count. There is a cupboard in a cloister wall with 50 books in it and a lock on the door, and one of those books is a third copied. And the man copying it has ruled the next page already and sharpened his pen and left it on the desk, pointing away from him. There is a fire banked under ash in the kitchen, holding its heat all night without a flame, waiting to be poked awake at 4 a.m. There is a row of greased boots along a wall in a warm room. And the fire in that room has been in since the beginning of November and will be in until Easter. There is a great cloth folded in a chest that will hang across the church for 6 weeks in the spring and hide the altar, and it is folded exactly the way it was folded last year, because there is a way of folding it and somebody was shown. There is a barrel of saltfish in a cellar with the lid on. There is an oven the size of a small room with the door shut and the last of the heat still in the bricks. There is a mill wheel standing still with the sluice shut and water going quietly past it down the lead instead. And the lead runs on round the hillside on a gradient so slight you cannot see it, carrying the same amount of water it has carried every night for 300 years. And it is enough. There is a lead pipe under the grass, bringing a spring from half a mile away into a stone trough in a cloister, and it has not been touched by anybody living. There are fish ponds stepped down a hillside, 3 of them, and the water in all 3 is completely flat. There is a row of straw skeps on a bench under a south wall with a plank over the top of them against the rain. And inside each one there is a cluster of bees hanging together in a ball in the dark, shivering very slowly, keeping each other alive until February. There is a great barn with the year's grain in it and a threshing floor swept clean between 2 shut doors. There is a cemetery in an orchard where the apple trees do unusually well, and there are no names on any of the stones. And every one of those names is written down in a book indoors and will be read aloud on the right morning. There is a wall a mile round with hart's tongue fern in the cracks. There is a stone trough in a corner of the cloister with a row of brass taps above it and a folded towel on a shelf beside it that was washed on Saturday, and a thin skin of ice beginning to form on the water in the bottom. There is a pulpit built into the thickness of a wall with a narrow stair inside the masonry going up to it, and it is dark, and there is a book on the desk at the top of it lying open at a page about the middle. There is a scrap of parchment stretched on a frame in a shed at the far end of the outer court, drying, with a curved blade hanging on a nail beside it, and it will be a page of something in about a month. There is a wooden tablet on a peg with the names of next week's servers scratched on it in wax. There is a small bowl of oak galls steeping in rainwater on a shelf, slowly turning the color of strong tea, and in a week it will be black. There is a sack of salt and a barrel of herring and a rack of tallow candles hanging on rods to cool. There is a stall by the door with a draught on it, and a young man asleep somewhere above it, who has been in this valley since Advent and will be here in 50 years. There is a lamp in a gatehouse. There is a valley with a stream in it going down over pale stones, saying the only thing it says. There is a moor above the woods with nothing on it at all except sheep lying down. And above that there is a great deal of sky. And in 3 hours the bell will go, and 40 men will get up in the dark without complaining and without speaking, and go down the worn stair, and stand in 2 rows facing each other in a freezing building, and sing about light in the middle of the night, exactly as they did last night, exactly as they will tomorrow. But not yet. None of it has to happen yet. And none of it has to happen because of you, and if it happened or did not happen tonight, the water would still go down the leat, and the bees would still hang in their ball, and the acorns would still be lying in the leaf litter waiting for their 200 years. It is all arranged. It was arranged a very long time ago by patient people. And none of them are waiting on you for anything. If you are still with me at all, let your breathing go long and slow now, and let it get longer, and do not do anything about it. Let your jaw come loose, let your tongue come away from the roof of your mouth. Let your shoulders come down 1 more inch if they have crept back up while you were listening, which they probably have. There is nothing left to follow. There was never very much to follow. That is the whole quality of the thing we have been walking round tonight, and it is why I wanted to spend a year in it with you rather than an hour. The year has no plot. It has a shape, and the shape is a circle, and every single thing in it comes back. The candles come back at the beginning of February. The veil goes up in the spring and comes down at Easter. The hay comes in June, and the wool at midsummer, and the corn in August, and the pigs go into the woods in October, and the fire is lit in the warming house on the 1st of November, and the lantern comes down the dormitory in December. And then all of it happens again. And the men doing it are slightly different men each time, because 1 or 2 have gone into the orchard, and 1 or 2 new ones have come in at the bottom of the row by the door, and it does not make the slightest difference to the shape. It is not a story about anybody in particular. Nobody in it is trying to win anything. Nobody is going anywhere. The whole enormous, carefully engineered apparatus, the wall and the water pipes, and the barn and the salter and the necrology and the 8 bells a day, exists to make it possible for a fairly ordinary man to stop deciding things and simply be somewhere, doing the same small, correct thing at the same hour, for 50 years. And then to have his name read out on a cold morning by people who never met him. You do not have to think that was a good life. Plenty of people at the time did not. You do not have to think it was true. But it was, whatever else it was, an astonishingly effective machine for producing calm, and 800 years later a description of it will still put a tired person to sleep, which is a fairly remarkable piece of engineering. If this helped tonight, you might like the video and you might subscribe, and it does genuinely help us find other people who are lying awake at this hour. But only if you truly enjoyed it, and only once you have slept, because that can wait and sleep cannot. And if you have not already. Leave your location and your local time in the comments below. Somebody in another country, in another season, is reading those comments right now at 3 a.m. and finding it a comfort to know they are not the only ones still awake. Neither are you. Thank you for spending the year in that valley with me. Now let all of it go. Let the wall go, and the barn, and the fish ponds, and the great gray church with the sheep in the nave. Let the reader come down from his pulpit and shut the book at the place he stopped. Let the porter's lamp burn down at the gate. Let the frost come on the grass in the middle of the cloister, and the stream go on down over the pale stones in the dark, and the sky turn very slowly over the whole valley the way it has turned over it for 800 years, and will go on turning long after all of us have finished worrying about anything at all. It is out of your hands. It always was. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.